at his belt. His hair was shaved to stubble, dusted with grey at the ears and close to bald on top. Heavy-browed, broad-nosed and slab-jawed like a prize-fighter, dark eyes fixed on Tunny. Perhaps it was his notable lack of neck, or the way the big knuckles stuck white from his clenched fists, or that his uniform looked as if it was stretched tight over rock, but even standing still, he gave the impression of fearsome strength. Tunny could salute with the very best when it seemed a wise idea, and now he snapped to vibrating attention. "Sir! Corporal Tunny, sir, standard-bearer of His Majesty's 1st Regiment." "General Jallenhorm's headquarters?" The newcomer's eyes flicked over the recruits, as if daring them to laugh at his piping voice. Tunny knew when to laugh, and now was not the moment. He pointed across the rubbish and tent-strewn meadow towards the farmhouse, smudges of smoke rising from the chimney and staining the bright sky. "You'll find the General there, sir. In the house, sir. Probably still in bed, sir." The officer nodded once, then strode off, head down, in a way that suggested he'd simply walk through anything and anyone in his way. "Who was that?" muttered one of the lads. "I believe that," Tunny let it hang in the air for a moment, "was Bremer Dan Gorst." "The one who fenced with the king?" "That's right, and was his bodyguard until that mess in Sapani. Still has the king's ear, some say. Not a good thing that such a notable personage should be here. Never stand near anyone notable." "What's he doing here?" "Couldn't say for sure, but I hear he's a hell of a fighter." And Tunny gave his front teeth a worried sucking. "Ain't that a good thing in a soldier?" asked Yoke. "Bloody hell no. Take it from me, who's lived through more than one melee, wars are hard enough work without people fighting in the middle of them." Gorst stalked into the front yard of the house, pulling something from his jacket, a folded paper, an order by the look of it. He saluted the guards and went in. Tunny rubbed at his rebelling stomach. Something didn't feel right, and not just last night's wine. "Sir!" "Corporal Tunny." I... It was the one called Worth, and he was in a fix. Tunny knew the signs, of course, the shifting from one leg to another, the pale features, the slightly dewy eyes. No time to spare. He jerked his thumb towards the latrine pits. "Go!" The lad took off like a scared rabbit, hopping bow-legged through the mud. "But make sure you crap in the proper place!" Tunny turned to wag one lecturing finger at the rest of the litter. "Always crap in the proper place. This is a principle of soldiering of far greater importance than any rubbish about marching or weapons or ground." Even at this distance, Worth's long groan could be heard, followed by some explosive farting. "Trooper Worth is fighting his first engagement with our real enemy out here, an implacable, merciless, liquid foe." He slapped a hand down on the shoulder of the nearest trooper, Yoke, as it happened, who nearly collapsed under the added weight. "Sooner or later, I've no doubt, you will all be called upon to fight your own battle of the latrines. Courage, boys, courage! Now, while we wait for Worth to force out the enemy or die bravely in the attempt, would any of you boys care for a friendly game of cards?" He produced the deck from nowhere, fanning it out under the recruit's surprised eyes, or eye, in Cligger's case, the mesmerizing effect only mildly damaged by Trooper Worth's ongoing arse music. "We'll just play for honor, to begin with. Nothing you can't afford to lose, eh? Nothing you can't—" Uh-oh. General Jallenhorm had emerged from his headquarters, jacket wide open, hair in disarray, face flushed beetroot red and shouting. He was always shouting, but this time he appeared for once to have a purpose. Gorst came after him, hunched and silent. Uh-oh. Jallenhorm stomped one way, seemed to think better of it, swiveled, roared at nobody, struggled with a button, slapped an assisting hand angrily away. Staff officers began to scatter from the house in all directions like birds whacked from the brush, chaos spreading rapidly from the general and infecting the entire camp.
Damn it,
muttered Tunny, shouldering his way into his braces.
We'd best get ready to move.
We just got here, Corporal, grumbled Yoke, pack halfway off. Tunny took hold of the strap and tugged it back over Yoke's shoulder, turned him by it to face towards the general. Jallenhorn was trying to shake his fist at a well-presented officer and button his own jacket at the same time, and failing. You have before you a perfect demonstration of the workings of the army. The chain of command, trooper, each man shitting on the head of the man below. The much-loved leader of our regiment, Colonel Valamir, is just getting shat on by General Jallenhorn. Colonel Valamir will shit on his own officers, and it won't take long to roll downhill, believe me. Within a minute or two, First Sergeant Forrest will arrive to position his bared buttocks above my undeserving head. Guess what that means for you lot? The lad stayed silent for a moment, then Cligger raised a tentative hand. The question was meant to be rhetorical, numbskull. He carefully lowered it again. For that, you get to carry my pack. Cligger's shoulders slumped. You, ladderlugger, Lederlingen, Corporal Tunny. Whatever. Since you love volunteering so much, you just volunteered to take my other pack. Yoke? Sir? Plain to see he could hardly stand under the weight of his own gear, Tunny sighed. You carry the hammock. New hands. Beck raised the axe high and snarled as he brought it down, split that log in two, and pretended all the while it was some Union soldier's head. Pretended there was blood spraying from it rather than splinters. Pretended the babbling of the brook was the sound of men cheering for him, and the leaves across the grass were women swooning at his feet. Pretended he was a great hero, like his father had been, won himself a high name on the battlefield and a high place at the fire and in the songs. He was the hardest bastard in the whole damn North, no doubt, far as pretending went. He tossed the split wood onto the pile, stooped down to drag up another log, wiped his forehead on his sleeve, and frowned across the valley, humming to himself from the lay of Ripton. Somewhere out there beyond the hills, Black Dow's army was fighting. Out there beyond the hills, high deeds were being done, and tomorrow's songs rippled. He spat into his palms, rough from wood axe and plough and scythe and shovel, and washboard even. He hated this valley and the people in it, hated this farm and the work he did on it. He was made to fight, not chop logs. He heard footsteps slapping, saw his brother struggling up the steep path from the house, bent over. Back from the village already, and it looked like he'd run the whole way. Beck's axe went up into the bright sky and came down, and one more southerner's skull was laid to waste. Feston made it to the top of the path and stood there, bent over, shaking hands on his wobbly knees, round cheeks blotchy pink, struggling for breath. "What's the hurry?" asked Beck, bending for more wood. There's... Feston fought to talk and breathe and stand up all at once. "There's men in the village!" he got out in a rush. "What sort of men?" "Carls! Ricci's Carls!" "What?" The axe hovered over Beck's head, forgotten. "Aye! And they got a weapon take on!" Beck stood there for a moment longer, then tossed the axe down on the pile of split logs and strode for the house. Strode fast and hard, his skin all singing. So fast, Feston had to trot along to keep up, asking, "What you gonna do?" over and over, and getting no reply. Past the pen and the staring goats, and the 5 big tree stumps, all hacked and scarred from years of Beck's blade practice every morning. Into the smoke-smelling darkness of the house, slashes of sunlight through the ill-fitting shutters, across bare boards and bald old furs. Wood creaked under his boots as he strode to his chest, knelt, pushed back the lid, tore his clothes out of the way with small patience, lifted it with fingers tender as a lover's, the only thing he cared for. Gold glimmered in the gloom, and he wrapped his fingers around the hilt, feeling the perfect balance of it, slid a foot-length of steel from the scabbard, smiled at that sound, that scraping, singing sound that set his already jangling nerves to thrill. How often had he smiled down like this, polishing, sharpening, polishing, dreaming of this day, and now it was come. He slapped the sword back in its sheath, turned, and froze. His mother stood in the doorway watching, a black shadow with the white sky behind. "I'm taking my father's sword," he snapped, shaking the hilt at her. "He was killed with that sword." "It's mine to take." "It is." "You can't make me stay here no more." He stuffed a few things in the pack he kept ready. "You said this summer." "I did." "You can't stop me going." "Do you see me trying?" "By my age, Shubal the Wheel had been 7 years on campaign." "Lucky him." "It's time. It's past time." "I know." She watched as he took his bow down, unstrung and wrapped up with a few shafts. "It'll be cold nights next month or two. Best take my good cloak with you." That caught him off guard. No, you should keep it. I'd be happier knowing you had it." He didn't want to argue in case he lost his nerve. Off all big and bold to face down 1,000 Southerners, but scared of the one woman who'd birthed him. So he snatched her good green-dyed cloak down from the peg and over his shoulder as he stalked for the door. Treated it like nothing, even though he knew it was the best thing she had. Feston was standing outside, nervous, not really understanding what was happening. Beck ruffled his red hair for him. "You're the man here now. Get them logs chopped and I'll bring you something back from the wars." "They've got nothing there we need," said his mother, eyeing him from the shadows. Not angry, like she used to be, just sad. He'd hardly realized till that moment how much bigger than her he was now. The top of her head hardly came up to his neck even. "We'll see." He took the 2 steps down to the ground outside, under the mossy eaves of the house, couldn't help turning back. "Well then." "One last thing, Beck." She leaned down and kissed him on his forehead. The softest of kisses, gentle as the rain. She touched his cheek and she smiled. "My son." He felt the tightness of tears in his throat, and he was guilty for what he'd said, and joyful to get his way at last, and angry for all the months he hadn't, and sad to go, and afraid and excited all at once. He could hardly make his face show one thing or another for all the different ways it was pulled. He touched the back of her hand quickly, and he turned before he started weeping, and strode away down the path and off to war. Strode the way he thought his father might have. The weapon take weren't quite what Beck had hoped for. Rain flitted down, not enough to make anyone wet, really, but enough to make everyone squint and hunch, to damp down the feel of the whole business. And the feel was pretty damn soggy already. Folk who'd come to join up, or been made to come, more likely, stood in things that might have started off as rows, but had melted into squelching, jostling, grumbling tangles. Most of them were young lads, too young for this, by Beck's reckoning. Lads who might never have seen the next valley, let alone a battle. Most of the rest were grey with age. A few cripples of one kind or another rounded out the numbers. At the edge of the crowd, some of Ricci's carls stood leaning on spears or sat mounted, looking every bit as unimpressed by the new recruits as Beck was. All in all, it was a long, low way from the noble band of brothers he'd been hoping to play a hero's part in. He shook his head, one fist holding his mother's cloak tight at his neck, the other underneath it, gripping the warm hilt of his father's sword. He didn't belong with this lot. Maybe Scarling Hoodless had started out with an unpromising crowd and made an army of them that beat the Union, but Beck couldn't see anyone telling high tales about this gathering of the hopeless. At one point he'd seen a new-made crew shambling by, and two little lads at the front only had one spear between them. A weapon take without enough weapons to go round. You don't hear much about that in the songs. For some reason, most likely on account of daydreaming it so often, he'd been half expecting old Call Reachy himself to be looking on. A man who'd fought in every battle since whenever. A man who did everything the old way. Maybe catching Beck's eye or giving him a slap on the back. Here's the kind of lad we need. Everyone, look at this lad. Let's find us some more like him. But there was no sign of Reachy, or anyone else who knew what they were doing. For a moment he looked at the muddy way he'd come and gave some hard thought to heading back to the farm. He could be home before dawn. Come to join up? A short man, but heavy in the shoulder, hair and stubble full of grey, a mace at his belt, looked like it had seen some action. He stood with his weight all on one leg, like the other might not take it. Beck weren't about to look the fool. He packed away any thoughts of quitting. I've come to fight. Good for you. My name's Flood, and I'll be taking charge of this little crew when it's mustered. He pointed out an unpromising row of boys, some with worn bows or hatchets, most with nothing but the clothes they stood in, and those in a sorry state. You want to do more than talk about fighting? Get in line. Reckon I will. Flood looked like he might know a sword from a sow at least, and one line looked pretty much as bad as another. So Beck swaggered up, chest out, and pushed his way in among the lads at the back. He fair towered over them, young as they were. I'm Beck, he said. Colving, muttered one. Couldn't have been more'n 13, and tubby with it, staring about wide-eyed, looking scared of everything. Stodder, mumbled around a mouthful of some rotten-looking meat by a hangdog lad with a fat lower lip, wet and dangling like he was touched in the head. I'm Brait, piped a boy even smaller than Colving, ragged as a beggar, dirty toes showing through the end of one split boot. Beck was getting ready to feel sorry for him until he realized how bad he smelled. Brait offered his skinny hand, but Beck didn't take it. He was busy sizing up the last of the group, older than the others, with a bow over his shoulder and a scar through one dark eyebrow. Probably just fell off a wall, but it made him look more dangerous than he'd any right to. Beck wished he had a scar. What about you? Reft. He'd this knowing little grin on his face Beck didn't much like the look of. Felt right away like he was being laughed at. Something funny? Reft waved a hand at the muddle all around him. Something not funny. You laughing at me? Not everything's about you, friend. Beck weren't sure if this lad was making him look a fool, or if he was doing it to himself, or if he was just hacked off because none of this matched his hopes, but he was getting angry, and fast. You might want to watch your fucking... But Reft weren't listening. He was looking over Beck's shoulder, and so were the rest of the lads. Beck turned to see what at, got a shock to find a rider looming over him on a high horse. A good horse with an even better saddle, metal on the harness polished to a neat twinkle. A man of maybe 30 years, by Beck's guess, clear-skinned and sharp-eyed. He wore a fine cloak with a stitched edge and a rich fur collar. Might have made Beck shamed of the one his mother had given him, if most of the others in the row hadn't been wearing little better than rags. Evening. The rider's voice was soft and smooth. The word hardly even sounded like northern. Evening, said Reft. Evening, said Beck. No chance he was going to let Reft play at being leader. The rider smiled down from his fancy saddle, just like they were all old mates together. I don't suppose you lads could point me to Reeche's fire? Reft stuck a finger into the gathering gloom. Over yonder, I reckon, on that rise there, near them trees. Black outlines against the evening sky, branches lit underneath by firelight. Much obliged to you. The man nodded to each of them, even Brait and Colving, then clicked his tongue and nudged his horse through the press, smirk still at the corner of his mouth, like he'd said something funny. Beck didn't see what. Who was that bastard? He snapped, once the rider was well out of earshot. Don't know, whispered Colving. Beck curled his lip at the lad. Course you don't. Weren't asking you, was I? Sorry. He flinched like he was expecting a slap. Just saying. Reckon that was the great Prince Calder, said Reft. Beck's lip curled further. What, Bethod's son? Ain't a prince no more then, is he? Reckon he thinks he is. Married to Reeche's daughter, any? Said Brait in his high little voice. Come to pay respects to his wife's father, maybe. Come to try and lie his way back into his father's chair, judging on his reputation, said Reft. Beck snorted. Don't reckon he'll get much change out of Black Dow. Get the bloody cross cutting him for the effort, more'n likely, grunted Stodder, licking his fingers as he finished eating. Get hung and burned, I reckon, piped up Colving. That's what he does, Black Dow, with cowards and schemers. Aye, said Brait, as though he was the great expert. Puts the flame to him himself and watches him dance. Can't say I'll weep any. Beck threw a dark glance after Calder, still easing through the press, high above everyone else in his saddle. If there was an opposite of a straight edge, it was that bastard. He don't look much of a fighter. So? Reft's grin dropped down to the hem of Beck's cloak, where the blunt end of the sword's sheath showed. You do look a fighter. Don't necessarily make it so. Beck weren't having that. He twitched his mother's cloak back over his shoulder to give him room, fists clenched. You calling me a fucking coward? Stodder slid carefully out of his way. Colving turned his scared eyes to the ground. Brait just had this helpless little smile. Reft shrugged, not quite rising to it, but not quite backing down either. Don't know you well enough to say what you are. Stood in the line, have you, in battle? Not in the line, snapped Beck, hoping they might think he'd fought a few skirmishes, when in fact, aside from some bare-handed tussles with boys in the village, he'd only fought trees. Then you don't know yourself, do you? Never can tell what a man'll do once the blades are drawn, shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the charge to come. Maybe you'll stand and fight like Scarling himself. Or maybe you'll run. Maybe you only talk a good fight. I'll show you a fight, you fucker! Beck stepped forwards, one fist going up. Colving gave a whimper, covered his face like he was the one might get hit. Reft took a pace back, pulling his coat open with one hand. Beck saw the handle of a long knife there, and he realized when he pushed the cloak back, he'd showed the hilt of his father's sword, and it was right by his hand, and it came to him of a sudden how high the stakes had climbed all out of nothing. It came to him in a flash this might not end up a tussle between boys in the village, and he saw the fear in Reft's eyes, and the willingness, and the guts dropped out of him, and he faltered for a moment, not knowing how he got here or what he should do. Oi! Flood lurched out of the crowd, dragging his bad leg behind him. Enough of that! Beck slowly let his fist drop, mightily glad of the interruption, if he was honest. Good to see you've some fire in you, but there'll be plenty of fight to go round with the Southerners, don't you worry about that. We got marching to do on the morrow, and you'll march better without smashed mouths. Flood held his big fist up between Beck and Reft, grey hairs on the back, knuckles scuffed from 100 old scrapes. And that's what you'll be getting unless you behave yourselves, understand? Aye, Chief, growled Beck, giving Reft the eye, though his heart was going so hard in his ears he thought it might pop him right off. Aye, course, said Reft, letting his coat fall closed. First thing a fighter has to learn is when not to fight. Now get up there, the pair of you. Beck realized the row of lads had melted away in front of him, and there was just a stretch of trampled mud between him and a table, an awning of dripping canvas over it to keep the rain off. An old greybeard sat there waiting for him and looking somewhat sour about it. He'd lost an arm, coat sleeve folded up and stitched across his chest. In the other hand he'd got a pen. Seemed they were taking each man's name and marking it down in a big book. New ways of doing things, with writing and what have you. Beck didn't reckon his father would have cared much for that, and neither did he. What was the purpose to fighting the Southerners if you took their ways yourselves? He trudged up through the slop, frowning.
Name? My name? Who the bloody hell else is?
Back. The greybeard scratched it on his paper.
From? A farm just up the valley there. Age? 17 year.
The man frowned up at him.
And a big one, too. You're a few summers late, lad. Where you been at? Helping my mother on the farm.
Someone behind snorted, and Beck whipped around to give him a proper glare. Brait's sorry little grin wilted, and he looked down at his knackered shoes.
She's two little uns to care for, so I stayed to help her. That's man's work, too. Yes, you're here now, anyway. That's right. Your father's name?
Sharma Heartless. His head jerked right back up at that.
Don't poke me, lad. I won't, old man. Sharma Heartless was my father. This here is his sword.
And Beck drew it, metal hissing, the weight in his hand putting heart right back at him, and stood it point down on the table. The one-armed old man looked it up and down for a moment, gold glinting with the sunset, mirror brightness of good steel.
Well, there's a turn-up. Let's hope you're forged from the same iron as your father. I am. Reckon we'll see. Here's your first staple, lad.
And he pressed a tiny silver coin into Beck's palm and took up his pen again.
Next man.
And there you go. Farmer no more. Joined up with Call Ricci and ready to fight for Black Dow against the Union. Beck sheathed his sword and stood frowning in the thickening rain, in the gathering darkness. A girl with red hair turned brown by the damp was pouring out grog for those who'd given their names, and Beck took his own measure and threw it burning down his gullet. He tossed the cup aside, watching Reft and Colving and Stodder give their answers, thinking how it didn't matter a shit what these fools thought. He'd win his name. He'd show 'em who was the coward and who was the hero. Ricci.
If it ain't my daughter's husband,
called out Ricci, firelight shining on a gap-toothed grin.
No need to tiptoe, lad.
Muddy going, said Calder.
And you always did like to keep your boots clean.
Styrian leather, shipped in from Tarlin's. And he planted one on a stone by the fire, so Ricci's old named men could get a better look.
Shipping in boots,
grumbled Ricci, as if bemoaning the loss of all that was good in the world.
By the dead, how did a clever girl like my daughter fall for a tailor's dummy like you?
How did a butcher's block like you father such a beauty as my wife? Ricci grinned, so his men did too, the rustling flames picking out every crease and crinkle on their leathery faces.
I've always wondered at it myself. Less than you, though. I knew her mother.
A couple of the older lads grunted, faraway looks in their eyes.
And I was quite the beauty myself before life's buffets wore down my looks.
The self-same older lads chuckled. Old men's jokes all about how fine things used to be.
Buffets,
said one, shaking his head. Could I have a word? Asked Calder.
Anything for my son. Lads.
Ricci's closest stood, some with evident effort, and made their way grunting off into the dark. Calder picked a spot by the fire and squatted down, hands out to the flames.
You want the pipe?
Ricci offered it, smoke curling from the bowl.
No thanks.
Calder had to keep a straight head, even among supposed friends. It was a damn narrow path he was always treading these days, and he couldn't afford to weave about. There was a long drop on both sides of it, and nothing soft at the bottom. Ricci took a suck himself, sent up a couple of little brown smoke rings, and watched them drift apart.
How's my daughter?
She's the best woman in the world. And he didn't even have to lie.
You always know what to say, don't you, Calder?
I won't disagree.
And my grandson?
Still a little small to help out against the Union this time around. But he's swelling. You can feel him kick.
Can't believe it.
Ricci looked into the flames and slowly shook his head, scrubbing at his white stubble with his fingernails.
Me, a grandfather. Seems like just yesterday I was a child myself. Just this morning I was watching Seth kick at her mother's belly. It all slips by so fast. Slips by and you hardly notice, like leaves on the water. Savor the little moments, son. That's my advice. They're what life is. All the things that happen while you're waiting for something else. I've heard Black Dow wants you dead.
Calder tried not to show he'd been thrown by the shift of subject and failed. Who says?
Black Dow.
No great surprise, but hearing it laid out stark as that didn't help Calder's shredded spirits.
I reckon he'd know. I think he's brought you back out here so he can find an easy way to kill you.
Or so someone else can, in hopes of earning favors from him.
I think he thinks you'll start scheming and turning men against him and trying to steal his chair. Then he'll find out about it and be able to hang you fair, and no one can complain over much.
He thinks if he hands me the knife, I'll stab myself.
Something like that.
Maybe I'm quicker-fingered than he reckons.
I hope you are. All I'm saying is, if you're planning on hatching a scheme or two, be aware he's aware, and he's waiting for you to miss a step. Providing he don't tire of tiptoeing around the issue and tell Cole Shivers to sharpen his axe on your brains. There'd be a few folk unhappy about that. True, and half the North's unhappy as it is. Too much war, too much tax. War's got a fine tradition round these parts, of course, but tax has never been popular. Dow needs to tread careful on folks' feelings these days, and he knows it. But it'd be a fool presumed too far on Black Dow's patience. He ain't a man made for treading carefully. But I suppose I am. There's no shame in a soft footfall, lad. We like big, stupid men in the north, men who wade about in blood and so on. We sing songs about 'em. But those men get nothing done alone, and that's a fact. We need the other kind. Thinkers, like you, like your father. And we don't make halfway enough of 'em. You want my advice?
Ricci could stick his advice up his arse as far as Calder was concerned. He'd come for men and swords and cold hearts ready to do treachery. But he'd long ago learned that most men love nothing better than to be listened to, especially powerful men. And Ricci was one of Dow's 5 war chiefs, about as powerful as it got these days. So Calder did what he was best at and lied. It's your advice I came for.
Then leave things be. Instead of swimming out against a fierce current, risking it all in the cold deep, sit on the beach a while, take your ease. Who knows? Maybe in good time the sea'll just wash up what you want. You reckon?
As far as Calder could tell, the sea had been washing up nothing but shit ever since his father died. Ricci shuffled a little closer, speaking low.
Black Dow ain't sat too firmly in Scarling's chair, for all he carts it around with him. He's the best bet for most, still, but outside of that rotten old fuck Tenways, he ain't got much loyalty. Lot less than your father had. And men these days, the likes of Ironhead and Golden,
and he snorted his contempt into the fire.
They're fickle as the wind. Folk fear Black Dow, but that only works long as you're fearsome. And if things keep dragging on, and he don't fight, folk got better things to do than sit around here going hungry and shitting in holes. I've lost as many men wandering off home to the harvest the last month as I'll pick up at this weapon take here. Dow has to fight, and soon. And if he don't, or if he loses, well, everything could spin around in an instant. And Ricci took a long, self-satisfied suck at his pipe. And what if he fights the Union and wins? Well, the old man squinted up at the stars as he finished blowing out his latest plume. That is a point you've got there. If he wins, he'll be everyone's hero. Not mine, I dare say. It was Calder's turn to lean close and whisper. And in the meantime, we're not on the beach. What if Dow tries to murder me, or gives me some task I can't but fail at, or puts me in the line somewhere I'm good as dead? Will I have any friends at my back? You're my daughter's husband, better or worse. Me and your father agreed to it when you and Seth weren't much more than babies. I was proud to take you when you had the world at your feet. What kind of a man would I be if I turned my back now you got the world on your shoulders? No, you're family. And he showed that missing tooth again, slapping his heavy hand down on Calder's shoulder. I do things the old way. Straight edge, eh? That's right. So you'd draw your sword for me? Shit, no. And he gave Calder's shoulder a parting squeeze and took his hand away. I'm just saying I won't draw it against you. If I have to burn, I'll burn, but I ain't setting myself on fire. About what Calder had expected, but still a disappointment. However many life gives you, each new one still stings. Where you going, lad? I think I'll meet up with Scale, help him with what's left of my father's men. Good idea. Strong as a bull, your brother, and brave as one with it. But, well, might be he's got a bull's brain, too. Might be. Word's come from Dow, he's calling the army together. We're all marching for Osrung tomorrow morning, heading for the heroes. Guess I'll catch up with Scale there, then. And a warming reunion, I don't doubt. Ricci waved a gnarled paw at him. Watch your back, Calder. That I will, he muttered under his breath. And Calder... Everyone always had just one more thing to say, and it never seemed to be something nice. Aye, you get yourself killed, that's one thing. But my daughter's stood hostage for you, done it willingly. I don't want you doing anything that's going to bring harm to her or to her child. I won't stand for that. I've told Black Dow, and I'm telling you, I won't stand for it. You think I will? Calder snapped back with a heat he hadn't expected. I'm not quite the bastard they say I am. I know you're not. And Ricci gave him a pointed look from under his craggy brows. Not quite. Calder left the fire with worry weighing on his shoulders like a coat of double mail. When the best you can get from your wife's father is that he won't help to kill you, it doesn't take a clever man to see you're in shit to your chin. Music was coming from somewhere. Old songs badly sung about men long dead and the men they'd killed. Drunken laughter, too. Figures around the fire pits drinking to nothing. A hammer rang from the darkness, and Calder caught the shape of the smith, frozen against the sparks of his forge. They'd be working all night, arming up Ricci's new recruits. Blades, axes, arrowheads. The business of destruction. He winced at the shriek of a whetstone. Something about that sound had always set his teeth on edge. He'd never understood what men saw in weapons. Probably a weapon take wasn't the best place for him, when you thought about it. He stopped, peering into the darkness. Somewhere around here he'd tied his horse. A boot squelched and he frowned over his shoulder. The shapes of two men, shaggy in the dark. A hint of a stubbly face. Somehow, right away he knew, and right away he took off running. Shit! Stop him! He pounded to nowhere, not thinking about anything, which was a strange relief for a moment, and then, as the first flush of action faded and he realized they were going to kill him, not. Help! He screamed at no one. Help me!
3 men about a fire looked over, part curious, part annoyed at being disturbed. None of them so much as reached for weapons. They didn't care a shit. People don't, on the whole. They didn't know who he was, and even if they had, he was widely hated. And even if he'd been widely loved, still, on the whole, no one cares a shit. He left them behind, scared breath starting to burn, slithered down a bank and up another, crashed through a patch of bushes, twigs snatching at him, not caring much about the state of his Styrian boots now, as the fear clawed up his throat. He saw a shape looming out of the murk, a pale face, startled. "Help!" he screeched. "Help!" Someone squatting, pinching off a turd. "What?" And Calder was past, thumping through the mud, leaving the fires of Ricci's camp behind. He snatched a glance over his shoulder, couldn't see a thing beyond the wobbling black outline of the land. But he could hear them still, too close behind. Far too close. He caught water glimmering at the bottom of a slope, then his lovely Styrian boot toe caught something, and he was in the air. He came down mouth first, crumpled, tumbled, head filled with his own despairing whimpers as the earth battered at him. Slid to what might have been a stop, though it felt like he was still going. Struggled up, arms clutching at him. "Off me, bastards!" It was his own cloak, heavy with mud. He floundered a half step, realized he was going up the bank as the killers came down it. He tried to turn and flopped over in the stream, gasping for air, cold water gripping him. "Some runner, ain't he?" The voice boomed through the surging blood in Calder's head, a nasty kind of chuckle on the end. Why do they always have to laugh? "How high? Come here!" That scraping sound as one drew a blade. Calder remembered he had a sword himself, fished numbly for it, trying to struggle up out of the freezing water. He only got as far as his knees. The nearest killer came at him, then fell over sideways. "What you doing?" said the other. Calder wondered if he'd drawn and stabbed him, then realized his sword was still all tangled up with his cloak. He couldn't have got it free even if he had the strength to move his arm, which at that moment he didn't. "What?" His tongue felt twice its normal size. A shape flashed from nowhere. Calder gave a kind of squeal, arms jerking pointlessly to cover his face. He felt the wind of something passing. It crashed into the second killer, and he went down on his back. The first was trying to crawl away up the bank, making a wet groan. The outline of a man walked down to him, slinging a bow over his shoulder and drawing a sword, and stabbed him through the back without breaking stride. He strolled up close and stood there, a blacker shape in the darkness. Calder stared at him through the spread-out fingers over his face, cold water bubbling at his knees, thinking of Seth, waiting for his death. "If it ain't Prince Calder, wouldn't expect a chance on you in such surroundings." Calder slowly prized his trembling hands away from his face. He knew that voice. "Foss Deep?" "Yes." Relief spouted up in Calder like a fountain, so much he almost wanted to laugh. Laugh or be sick. "My brother sent you?" "No." "Scales busy these days," grunted Shallow, still stabbing the second killer, blades squelching in and out. "Very busy." Deep watched his brother as if he was watching a man dig a ditch. "Fighting and so forth. War. The old swords and marching game. Loves him some war, Scale. Can't get enough. If that's not dead yet, by the way, ain't never gonna be." "True." Shallow stabbed his man once more, then rocked back on his haunches, his blade and his hand and his arm to the elbow, all sticky black with blood in the moonlight. Calder made himself not look at it, trying to keep his mind off his rising gorge. "Where the hell did you come from?" Deep offered a hand, and Calder took it. "We heard you were returned from exile, and, aware what a popular boy you are, thought we'd come and stand lookout, in case someone tried something. And whatever do you know?" Calder held Deep's forearm a moment longer as the dark world started to steady. "Good thing you came when you did. Moment longer, I'd have had to kill those bastards myself." He stood, The blood rushed to his head, and he doubled up and puked all over his Styrian boots. "Things were about to get ugly, all right," said Deep solemnly. "If you could just have got your sword free from your fancy-ass cloak, you'd have cut those bastards up every which way." Shallow was coming down the slope and dragging something after him. "We caught this one. He was holding their horses." And he shoved a shape down in the mud in front of Calder. A young lad, pale face dirt-speckled in the half-light. "That's some good work." Calder wiped his sour mouth on the back of his sleeve. "My father always said you were two of the best men he knew." "Funny." He could see Shallow's teeth as he grinned. "He used to tell us we were the worst." "Either way, don't know how I'll thank you." "Gold?" said Shallow. "Aye," said Deep. "Gold will go most of the way." "You'll have it?" "I know we will. That's why we love you, Calder." "Well, that and the winning sense of humour," said Shallow. "And that beautiful face, and those beautiful clothes, and the smirk that makes you want to punch it." "And the bottomless respect we had for your father." Shallow gave a little bow. "But yes, mostly it's the old Goldie-Woldy." "What rights for the dead?" asked Deep, poking one of the corpses with the toe of his boot. Now that Calder's head was settling, the surging of blood in his ears was quieting, the pounding in his face was dulling to a throb, he was starting to think, to wonder what could be gained. He could show these boys to Ricci, try and get him riled up. Murdering his daughter's husband in his own camp, it was an insult, especially to an honourable man. Or he could have them dragged before Black Dow, fling them at his feet and demand justice. But both options held risks, especially when he didn't know for a fact who was behind it. When you're planning what to do, always think of doing nothing first. See where that gets you. It was better to let these bastards wash away, pretend it never happened, and keep his enemies guessing. "In the river," he said. "And this one?" Shallow waved his knife at the lad. Calder stood over him, lips pursed. "Who sent you?" "I just mind the horses," whispered the boy. "Come on now," said Deep. "We don't want to cut you up." "I don't mind," said Shallow. "No?" "Not bothered." He grabbed the boy around the throat and stuck his knife up his nose. "No, no," he squeaked. "Tanways, they said. They said broad Tanways." Shallow let him drop back in the mud, and Calder gave a sigh. That fleeking old fuck. How toweringly unsurprising. Maybe Dow had asked him to get it done, or maybe he'd taken his own initiative. Either way, this lad wouldn't know enough to help. Shallow spun his knife around, blade flashing moonlight as it turned. "And for young master, I just mind the horsey boy." Calder's instinct was just to say, kill him and be done. Quicker, simpler, safer. But these days he tried always to think about mercy. A long time ago, when he'd been a young idiot, or perhaps a younger idiot, he'd ordered a man killed on a whim, because he'd thought it would make him look strong, because he'd thought it might make his father proud. It hadn't. "Before you make a man into mud," his father had told him afterwards in his disappointed voice, "make sure he's no use to you alive. Some men will smash a thing just because they can. They're too stupid to see that nothing shows more power than mercy." The lad swallowed as he looked up, eyes big and hopeless, gleaming in the darkness, with maybe a sorry tear or two. Power was what Calder wanted most, and so he thought about mercy. Thought all about it. Then he pressed his tongue into his split lip, and it really hurt a lot. "Kill him," he said, and turned away, heard the lad make a surprised yelp, quickly cut off. It always catches people by surprise, the moment of their death, even when they should see it coming. They always think they're special, somehow expect a reprieve. But no one's special. He heard the splash as Shallow rolled the lad's body into the water, and that was that. He struggled back up the slope, cursing at his soaked-through, clinging cloak and his mud-caked boots and his battered mouth. Calder wondered if he'd be surprised when his moment came. Probably. The right thing. Is it true? Asked Droft. Aye. Is it true? The lad nodded towards Scarling's finger, standing proud on its own tump of hill, casting no more than a stub of shadow since it was close to midday.
That Scarling Hoodless is buried under there?
Doubt it, said Craw. Why would he be?
Ain't that why they call it Scarling's Finger, though?
What else would they call it? Asked Wonderful.
Scarling's Cock?
Brack raised his thick brows. Now you mention it, it does look a bit like a... Droft cut him off.
No, I mean, why call it that if he ain't buried there?
Wonderful looked at him like he was the biggest idiot in the north. He might have been in the running.
There's a stream near my husband's farm, my farm, they call Scarling's Beck. There's probably 50 others in the north. Most likely, there's a legend he wet his manly thirst in their clear waters before some speech or charge or noble stand from the songs. Dare say he did no more than piss in most of them if he ever came within a day's ride. That's what it is to be a hero. Everyone wants a little bit of you.
She nodded at Wirren, kneeling before the Father of Swords, with hands clasped and eyes closed.
In 50 years, there'll more than likely be a dozen Wirren's Becks scattered across farms he never went to, and numbskulls will point at him, all dewy-eyed, and ask, "Is it true Wirren of Bly's buried under that stream?"
She walked off, shaking her cropped head. Droft's shoulders slumped.
I only bloody asked, didn't I? I thought that was why they called them the heroes, 'cause there are heroes buried under 'em.
Who cares who's buried where? Muttered Craw, thinking about all the men he'd seen buried. Once a man's in the ground, he's just mud. Mud and stories. The stories and the men don't often have much in common. Brack nodded. Less with every time the story's told.
Eh?
Bethard, let's say, said Craw. You'd think to hear the tales he was the most evil bastard ever set foot in the north.
Weren't he?
Depends on who you ask. His enemies weren't keen on him, and the dead know he made a lot of the bastards.
But look at all he did. More than Scarling Hoodless ever managed. Bound the north together. Built the roads we march on. Half the towns. Put an end to the warring between the clans. By starting wars with the southerners. Well, true. There's two sides to every coin. But there's my very point. People like simple stories.
Craw frowned at the pink marks down the edges of his nails.
But people ain't simple.
Brack slapped Droft on the back and near made him fall.
Except for you, eh, boy?
Craw! Wonderful's voice had that note in it made everyone turn. Craw sprang up, or as close as he got to springing these days, and hurried over to her, wincing as his knee crunched like breaking twigs, sending stings right up into his back.
What am I looking at?
He squinted at the old bridge, at the fields and pastures and hedgerows, at the river and the fells beyond, struggling to shield his watery eyes from the wind and make the blurry valley come sharp.
Down there, at the ford.
Now he saw them, and his guts hollowed out. Little more than dots to his eyes, but men for sure. Wading through the shallows, picking their way over the shingle, dragging themselves up onto the bank. The north bank. Craw's bank. Shit, he said. Not enough of them to be Union men, but coming from the south, which meant they were the Dogman's boys, which meant, more than likely, Hardbread's back. Shiver's whisper was the last thing Craw needed behind him. And he's found himself some friends.
Weapons!
Shouted Wonderful.
Aye?
Agric stood staring with a cookpot in his hands.
Weapons, idiot! Shit!
Agric and his brother started running around, shouting at each other, dragging their packs open and spilling gear about the trampled grass.
How many do you count?
Craw patted his pocket, but his eyeglass was missing.
Where the bloody hell?
Brack had it pressed to his face.
22,
he grunted.
You sure? I'm sure.
Wonderful rubbed at the long scar down her scalp.
22. 22. 22.
The more she said it, the worse it sounded. A particularly shitty number. Too many to beat without taking a terrible chance, but few enough that, with the ground on their side and a happy fall of the runes, it might be done. Too few to just run away from without having to tell Black Dow why. And fighting outnumbered might be the lighter risk than telling Black Dow why. Shit. Craw glanced across at Shivers and caught his good eye looking back. Knew he'd juggled the same sum and come up with the same answer, but that he didn't care how much blood got spilled along the way, how many of Craw's dozen went back to the mud for this hill. Craw did care. Maybe too much these days. Hardbread and his boys were out of the river now, last of them disappearing into the browning apple trees between the shallows and the foot of the hill, heading for the children. Jon appeared between two of the heroes, bundles of sticks in his arms, puffing away from the climb.
Weapons!
Bellowed Brack at him.
Hardbread's back!
Added Athrock.
Shit!
Jon let his sticks fall in a tangle, near tripped over them as he ran for his gear. It was a bastard of a call, and Craw couldn't dither on it. But that's what it is to be chief. If he'd wanted easy choices, he could have stayed a carpenter, where you might on occasion have to toss out a botched joint, but rarely risk a friend's life. He'd stuck all his days to the notion there's a right way to do things, even as it seemed to be going out of fashion. You pick your chief, you pick your side, you pick your crew, and then you stand by 'em, whatever the wind blows up. He'd stood by 3 trees till he lost to the Bloody Nine, stood by Bethod till the end. Now he stood with Black Dow, and, whatever the rights and wrongs of it, Black Dow said hold this hill. They were fighters by trade. Time comes, a fighter has to toss the runes and fight. It was the right thing to do. The right thing, he hissed to himself. Or maybe it was just that, deep under his worries and his grumbles and his blather about sunsets, there was still a jagged little splinter left in him of that man he'd been years ago. That dagger-eyed fucker who would have bled all the blood in the north before he backed down astride. The one who stuck himself in everyone's craw.
Weapons!
He growled.
Full gear! Battle gear!
Hardly needed saying, really. But a good chief should shout a lot. Jon was delving into the pack-horse's bags for the mail, dragging Brack's big coat rattling free. Scorry pulling his spear from the other side, jerking the oilskin from the bright blade, humming to himself while he did it. Wonderful, stringing her bow with quick hands, making it sing its own note as she tested it. All the while, Wirren knelt still, eyes closed, hands clasped before the Father of Swords.
Chief!
Scorry tossed Craw's blade over, stained belt wrapped around it. Thanks. Though he didn't feel too thankful as he snatched it out of the air. Started to buckle it on, memories of other bright, fierce times he'd done it flashing by. Memories of other company, long gone back to the mud. By the dead, but he was getting old. Droft stared around for a moment, hands opening and closing. Wonderful gave him a slap on the side of the head as she passed, and he came round, started loosening the shafts in his quiver with twitchy fingers. Chief! She handed Craw his shield, and he slid it onto his arm, strap fitting into his clenched fist, snug as a foot into an old boot. Thanks. Craw looked over at Shivers, standing still with his arms folded, watching the dozen make ready.
How about you, lad? Front rank?
Shivers tipped his face back. little grin on the side that wasn't stiff with scar. "Front and middle," he croaked. Then he ambled off towards the ashes of the fire. "We could kill him," Wonderful muttered in Craw's ear. "Don't care how hard he is. Arrow in the neck, job done." "He's just passing the message." "Shooting the messenger ain't always a bad idea." Joking, but only half. Stops him taking messages back. "Whether or not he's here, we've the same job. Keep hold of the heroes. We're meant to be fighters. A little fight shouldn't get us shitting ourselves." He almost choked on the words, since he was mostly shitting himself from morning to night, and especially in fights. "A little fight," she muttered, loosening her sword in its sheath. "Near 3-1? Do we really need this hill?" "Closer to 2-1, as if that made it good odds. If the Union do come, this hill's the key to the whole valley," giving himself reasons as much as her. "Better to fight for it now while we're up here, and give it away so we can fight our way up it later. That, and it's the right thing to do." She opened her mouth like she was going to argue. "The right thing," snapped Craw, and held his hand out, not wanting to give her the chance to talk him round. She took a breath. "All right." She gave his hand a squeeze, almost painful. "We fight." And she walked away, pulling her archery guard on with her teeth. "Arm up, you bastards! We fight!" Athrock and Agric were ready, helmets on, bashing their shields together and grunting in each other's faces, working themselves up to it. Scorry was holding his spear just under the blade, using it to shave bits of shudder root off a lump and into his mouth. Wirren had finally stood up, and now he was smiling into the blue sky with his eyes closed, sun on his face. His preparations didn't go much beyond taking his coat off. "No armor." Jon was helping Brack into his mail, shaking his head as he frowned over at Wirren. "What kind of a bloody hero don't wear bloody armor?" "Armor," mused Wirren, licking a finger and scrubbing some speck of dirt from the pommel of his sword, "is part of a state of mind in which you admit the possibility of being hit." "What the fuck?" Jon tugged hard at the straps and made Brack grunt. "What does that even mean?" Wonderful clapped her hand down on Wirren's shoulder and leaned against him, one foot propped on its boot toe. "How many years and you're still expecting sense out of this article? He's mad." "We're all fucking mad, woman." Brack was red in the face from holding his breath out, while Jon struggled to get the buckles closed at his back. "Why else would we be fighting for the hill and some old rocks?" "War and madness have a lot in common." Scorry, not very helpfully, talking around his cheekful of mush. Jon finally got the last buckle shut and held his arms out so Brack could start getting him into his mail. "Being mad don't stop you wearing bloody armor, though, does it?" Hardbread's crew had made it through the orchards, and 2 sets of 3 split from the rest, one heading west around the base of the hill, the other north, getting around their flanks. Droft's eyes were wide as he watched them moving, then the others getting their gear ready. "How can they make jokes? How can they make bloody jokes?" "Because every man finds courage his own way." Craw didn't admit that giving advice was his. There's nothing better for a dose of terror than standing by someone even more terrified than yourself. He clasped Droft's hand and gave it a squeeze. "Just breathe, lad." Droft took a shuddering breath in and forced it out. "Right you are, Chief. Breathe." Craw turned to face the rest of the crew. "Right then. They've 2 parties of 3 trying to get on our flanks, then a few less than a score coming up front." He rushed through the numbers, maybe hoping no one would notice the odds, maybe hoping he wouldn't. "Athrock, Agric, Wonderful to skirmish. Droft too. Give 'em arrows while they climb, spread 'em out on the slope. When they get in close to the stones, we charge." He saw Droft swallow, not much taken with the idea of charging. The dead knew Craw could think of other ways to spend an afternoon himself.
There aren't enough of 'em to get all around us, and we've got the ground. We can pick where we hit 'em, and hit 'em hard. Any luck, we'll break 'em before they get set. Then if the other 6 have a mind to fight, we can mop up. Hit 'em hard, growled Jon, clasping hands with the others one after another. Just wait for my word, and move together. Together. Wonderful slapped her right hand into Scorry's and punched him on the arm with her left. Me, Shivers, Brack, Jon, we're front and centre. Aye, Chief, said Brack, still struggling with Jon's mail. Fucking aye. Jon took a practice swipe with his axe and jerked the buckles out of Brack's hands. Shivers grinned and stuck his tongue out, not especially reassuring. Athrock and Agric fall back to the wings. Aye, they chimed in together. Scorry, anyone tries to get around the side early on, give 'em a poke. Once we close up, you're the back rank. Scorry just hummed to himself, but he'd heard. Wirren, you're the nut in the shell. No. Wirren took the Father of Swords from its place against the stone and lifted it high, pommel glinting with the sunlight. This is, which makes me, I guess, that kind of flaky bit between the nut and the shell. You're flaky, all right, muttered Wonderful under her breath. You can be whatever bit of the nut you like, said Craw, long as you're there when it cracks. Oh, I'm going nowhere until you show me my destiny. Wirren pushed back his hood and scrubbed a hand through his flattened hair. Just like Shoglig promised me you would. Craw sighed. Can't wait. Questions? No sound except the wind fumbling across the grass, the clapping of palms as they all finished shaking hands, the grunt and jingle as Brack finally got Jon's armour buckled. All right. In case I don't have the chance to say it again, been an honour fighting with you all, or an honour slogging across the north in all weathers anyway. Just keep in mind what Rudd Three Trees once told me. Let's us get them killed, and not the other way round. Wonderful grinned. Best damn advice about war I ever heard. The rest of Hardbread's lads were coming now, the big group, coming slowly, taking time, up the long slope towards the children. More than dots now, a lot more than dots. Men, with a purpose, the odd glint of sunlight on sharp metal. A heavy hand thumped down on his shoulder and Craw jumped, but it was only Jon behind him. A word, Chief. What's to do? Though he knew already. The usual. If I'm killed. Craw nodded, keen to cut it short. I'll find your sons and give 'em your share. And I'll tell 'em what you were. All of it? All of it. Good. And don't dress it up any, you old bastard. Craw waved a hand at his stained coat. When did you last see me dress anything up? Jon might have had a trace of a smile as they clasped hands. Not lately, Chief, that's sure. Left Craw wondering who'd need telling when he went back to the mud. His family were all here. Talking time, said Wonderful. Hardbread had left his men behind at the children and was climbing the grassy slope with empty hands and open grin turned up towards the heroes. Craw drew his sword, felt the frightening, reassuring weight of it in his hand, knew the sharpness of it, worked at with whetstone every day for a dozen years. Life and death in a length of metal. Makes you feel big, don't it? Shivers spun his own axe around in one fist, a brutal-looking article, studs through the heavy wooden shaft, bearded head notched and gleaming. A man should always be armed, if only for the feel of it. An unarmed man is like an unroofed house, muttered Jon. They'll both end up leaking, Brack finished for him. Hardbread stopped well within bowshot, long grass brushing at his calves. Hey, hey, Craw! Still up there, then? Sadly, yes. Sleeping well? I'd rather have a feather pillow. You brought me one. Wish I had one spare. That calls Shivers up there with you. Aye, and he brought 24 Carls with him. It was worth a stab, but Hardbread only grinned. Good try. No, he didn't. Haven't seen you in a while, Cole. How are things?
Shivers gave the smallest shrug, nothing more. Hardbread raised his brows.
Like that is it?
Another shrug, like the sky could fall in and it'd make no difference to him.
Have it your way. How about it then, Craw? Can I have my hill back?
Craw worked his hand around the grip of his sword, raw skin at the corners of his chewed fingernails burning.
I've a mind to sit here a few days more.
Hardbread frowned. Not the answer he'd been hoping for.
Look, Craw, you gave me a chance the other night, so I'm giving you one. There's a right way of doing things, and fair's fair. But you might have noticed I had some friends come up this morning.
And he jerked his thumb over his shoulder towards the children.
So I'll ask one more time. Can I have my hill back?
Last chance. Craw gave a long sigh and shouted it into the wind.
Fraid not, Hardbread. Fraid you'll have to come up here and take it off me. How many you got up there? 9? Against my 2 dozen? We face down worse odds.
No, he couldn't remember ever picking 'em willingly.
Good for fucking you. I wouldn't fancy it.
Hardbread brought his voice back down from angry to reasonable.
Look, there ain't no need for this to get out of hand. Except we're in a war!
And Craw found he'd roared the last word with a sight more venom than he'd planned on. Far as he could tell over the distance, Hardbread had lost his grin.
Right you are. Thought I'd give you the chance you gave me is all. That's good of you. Appreciate it. Just can't move. That's a shame all round. Aye, but there 'tis.
Hardbread took a breath like he was about to speak, but he didn't. He just stood still. So did Craw. So did all his crew behind him, looking down. So did all Hardbread's, too, looking up. Silent on the heroes, except for the wind sighing, a bird or two warbling somewhere, a few bees buzzing in the warm, tending to the flowers. A peaceful moment, considering they had a war to be about. Then Hardbread snapped his mouth shut, turned around, and walked back down the steep slope towards the children. "I could shoot him," muttered Wonderful.
"I know you could," said Craw, "and you know you can't."
"I know, just saying."
"Maybe he'll think it over and decide against."
But Brack didn't sound all that hopeful.
"No, he don't like this any more than us, but he backed down once already. His odds are too good to do it again."
Craw almost whispered the last words.
"Wouldn't be right."
Hardbread reached the children and vanished among the stones.
"Everyone without a bow, back inside the heroes, and wait for the moment."
The quiet stretched out, niggling pain in Craw's knee as he shifted his weight. Raised voices behind, Jon and Brack arguing about nothing as they got their stub of a line ready. More quiet. War's 99 parts boredom, and now and then 1 part arse-opening terror. Craw had a powerful sense one of those was about to drop on him from a height. Agric had planted a few arrows in the earth, flights fluttering like the seed heads on the long grass. Now he rocked back on his heels, rubbing at his jaw.
"Might be he'll wait for dark." "No, if he's been sent more men, it's 'cause the Dogman wants this hill. The Union wants this hill. He won't risk his getting help by tonight."
"Then," muttered Droft.
"I reckon they'll be coming now."
By some unhappy chance, as Craw said the word now, men started to ease out from the shadows of the children. They formed up in an orderly row at a steady pace. A shield wall, perhaps a dozen men wide, spear points of a second row glittering behind, archers on the flanks, staying in the cover of the shields.
"Old style,"
said Wonderful, knocking an arrow.
"Wouldn't expect nothing else from Hardbread. He's old style himself."
A bit like Craw. 2 old leftover fools lasted longer than they'd any right to. setting to knock chunks out of each other. The right way, at least. They'd do it the right bloody way. He looked to the sides, straining for some sign of the two little groups who'd broken off. Couldn't see no one. Crawling in the long grass, maybe, or just biding their time. Agric drew his bowstring back to his frown.
When do you want me to shoot?
Soon as you can hit something.
Anything in particular?
Craw scraped his tongue over his front teeth.
Anyone you can put down.
Say it straight, why not? He ought to have the bones to say it, at least.
Anyone you can kill. I'll do my best.
Do your worst and I'll be happier.
Right you are.
Agric let fly, just a ranging shot, flitting over the heads of Hardbread's lot and making them duck. Wonderful's first arrow struck humming into a shield, and the man behind it dropped back, dragging the shield wall apart. It was starting to break up anyway, for all Hardbread's shouting. Some men moving quicker, some tiring faster on that bastard of a slope. Droft shot too, his arrow going way high, lost somewhere short of the children.
Shit!
He cursed, snatching at another arrow with a trembling hand.
Easy, Droft, easy. Breathe.
But Craw was finding easy breathing a bit of a challenge himself. He'd never cared for arrows, especially it hardly needed saying when they were falling out of the sky at him. They didn't look much, but they could have your death on the end all right. He remembered seeing the shower of them dropping down towards their line at Innerwood, like a flock of angry birds. Nowhere to run to, just had to hope. One sailed up now, and he stepped sideways behind the nearest hero, crouching in the cover of his shield. Not much fun watching that shaft spin down, wondering whether the wind would snatch it at the last moment and put it right through him. It glanced off the stone and spun harmlessly away. Not a lot of air between your death and an arrow in the grass. The man who'd shot it paused on one knee, fiddling with his quiver as the safety of the shields crept up the slope away from him. Athroc's shaft took him in the stomach. Craw saw his mouth open wide, his own arrow flying from his hand, his scream coming a moment later, sputtering out into a long-drawn wail. Maybe it was the sound of their odds getting that little bit better, but Craw still didn't much like hearing it. Didn't like the notion that he might be making a sound like that himself before the hour was out. The end of the shield wall got ragged as men looked over at the howling archer, wondering whether to help or press on, or just wondering whether they'd be next. Hardbread barked orders, straightened up his line, but Wonderful's next arrow flitted close over their heads and bent them out of shape again. Craw's people had the height as an ally, could shoot fast and flat. Hardbread's had to shoot high, where the wind was sure to drag their shafts around. Still, there was no call to take chances. They wouldn't be settling this with arrows. Craw let Droft loose one more, then grabbed his arm.
Back to the others.
The lad jerked around, looking like he was about to scream. Battle lust on him, maybe. You never could tell who'd get it. Mad fear and mad courage are two leaves on one nettle, all right, and you wouldn't want to grab a hold of either one. Craw dug his fingers into the lad's shoulder and dragged him close.
Back to the others, I said.
Droft swallowed, Craw's hand squeezing the sense back into him.
Chief.
And he stumbled back between the stones, bent double.
Fall back when you have to,
Craw shouted at Wonderful.
Take no chances.
Too fucking right, she hissed over her shoulder, knocking another shaft. Craw crept backwards, keeping an eye out for arrows until he was past the stones, then hurrying across the circle of grass, stupidly happy to get another couple of moments safe and feeling a coward because of it.
They're on the... Gah!
Something caught his foot and he twisted his ankle, pain stabbing up his leg. Limped the rest of the way, teeth bared, and fell into line in the center. Evil, those rabbit holes, whispered Shivers. Before Craw could gather the wits to answer, Wonderful came running between two of the heroes, waving her bow.
They're past the wall! Got one more of the bastards!
Agric was at her heels, swinging his shield off his back, an arrow looping over from behind and sticking into the turf by his boots as he ran. "The rest are coming!" Craw could hear their shouting from down below, still the faint scream of the stuck archer, all turned strange by the wind. "Get back here!" he heard Hardbred bellow, short on breath. Sounded like they were still losing shape on the run-up, some eager, some the opposite, not used to fighting together. That favoured Craw's crew, most of them been together for what felt like centuries. He stole a glance over his shoulder, and Scorry winked back, chewing away. Old friends, old brothers. Wirren had his sword out of its sheath, great lengths of dull grey metal with hardly a gleam to its edge even in the sun. Like the runes had said, there was going to be blood. The only question was, whose? It passed between them as their eyes met, no word spoken and none needed. Wonderful knelt at the end of their little line in the shadow of Athroc's shield, nocked an arrow, and Craw's dozen were ready as they'd ever get. Someone crept around one of the stones. His shield might have had something painted on it once, but so scuffed by war and weather there was no telling what. Sword bright in his hand, helmet on, but he hardly looked like anyone's enemy. He looked knackered, mouth hanging open, panting from the long climb. He stood staring at them, and they stared back. Craw felt Yon straining next to him, bursting to go, heard Shiver's breath crackling through gritted teeth, heard Brack growling deep in his throat, everyone's jangling nerves setting everyone else's jangling even worse. "Steady," Craw hissed. "Steady." Knew the hardest thing at a time like that was just to stand. Men ain't made for it. You need to charge or you need to flee. But either way, you're desperate to move, to run, to scream. Had to wait, though. Finding the right moment was everything. Another of Hardbred's crew showed themselves, knees bent low, peering over his shield. It had a fish painted on it, and badly. Craw wondered if his name was Fishy, felt a stupid urge to laugh, quickly gone. They had to go soon, use the ground, catch 'em on the slope, break 'em fast. It was up to him to feel the moment, like he knew. Time was stretched out, full of details. Breath in his sore throat, breeze tickling the back of his hand, blades of grass shifting with the wind. His mouth so dry he wasn't sure he'd be able to say the word even if he thought the time was right. Droft loosed an arrow and the two men ducked down, but the sound of the string loosed something in Craw, and before he'd even thought whether it was the right moment or not, he'd given a great roar. Hardly even a word, but his crew got the gist, and like a pack of dogs suddenly slipped the leash, they were away. Too late now. Maybe one moment's good as another anyway. Feet pounding the ground, jolting his teeth, jolting his sore knee. Wondering if he'd hit another rabbit hole, go sprawling. Wondering where the 6 men were who'd gone around him. Wondering whether they should have backed off. What those 2 idiots, 3 now, they were charging at were thinking. What lies he'd tell Yon's sons. The others matched him step for step, rims of their shields scraping against his, jostling at his shoulders. Jolly Yon on one side and Call Shivers on the other. Men who knew how to hold a line. It occurred to Craw he was probably the weak link in here. Then that he thought too much. Hardbred's boys skipped and wobbled with each footfall, more of 'em up now, trying to get some shape between the stones. Yon let go his war cry, high and shrill, then Athroc and his brother too. Then they were all giving it the screech and wail, boots hammering the old sod of the heroes. Ground where men prayed once, maybe, long ago, prayed for better times. Craw felt the terror and joy of battle burning in his chest, burning up his throat. Hardbred's men a buckled line of shields, blurred weapons between, blades swaying, twinkling. They were between the stones. They were on 'em. "Break!" roared Craw. Him and Yon went left, Shivers and Brack went right, and Wirren came out of the gap they left, howling his devil shriek. Craw caught a glimpse of the nearest face, jaw dropping, eyes wide. Men ain't just brave or not. It all depends on how things stand, who stands beside 'em. Whether they've just had to run up a great big fucking hill with arrows falling on 'em. He seemed to shrink, this lad, trying to get his whole body behind his shield as the Father of Swords fell on him like a mountain sharpened to a razor edge. Metal screamed, wood and flesh burst apart, blood roaring and men roaring in Craw's ears. He twisted himself sideways, missed a spear thrust, crashed on, blade rattling off wood, turning him, went into someone's shield first with a bone-jarring crunch and sent him over backwards, sliding down the hillside. He saw Hardbread, long grey hair tangled around his face. His sword went up quick, but Wirren was quicker, arms snaking out and ramming the pommel of the Father of Swords into Hardbread's mouth, snapping his head back and sending him toppling. Craw had other worries. Crushed against a snarling cave of a face, sour breath blasting him, dragging at his snagged sword, trying to get space to swing. He shoved with his shield, had the slope on his side, drove his man back enough to make room. Athrock whacked a shield with his axe, got his whacked in reply. Craw chopped, his elbow caught on the shaft of a spear, tangled with it, his sword just tapped someone with the flat. A friendly pat on the shoulder. Wirren was in the midst of 'em, Father of Swords making blurred circles, scattering men squealing. Someone got in the way, Hardbread's nephew. Oh! And he fell in half. His arm flew in the air, body turning over and around, legs toppling. The long blade pinged like ice shifting as the weather warms, spots of blood showering off it. Craw gasped as they pit-pattered on his face, hacked away at a shield, teeth squeezed together so hard seemed they'd crack. Still snarling something through 'em, didn't know what, splinters in his face. Movement at the corner of his eye, shield up on an instinct, and something thudded into it, cracking the rim into his jaw, making him stumble sideways, arm numbed. He saw a weapon black against bright sky, caught it on his own as it came down. Blades clashing, scraping, grunting in someone's face. Looked like Jutland, but Jutland was years in the ground. Staggering around, off balance on the slope, fingers clutching. His knee burned, his lungs burned. Gleam of Shiver's eye, battle smile creasing his ruined face. His axe split Jutland's head open wide, dark pulp smeared down Craw's shield. Shoved him off, corpse tumbling through the grass. Father of Swords ripped armor beside him, bent mail rings flying, stinging the back of Craw's hand. Clash and clatter, scrape and rattle, scream and hiss, thump, crack, men swearing and bellowing like animals at the slaughterhouse. Was Scorry singing? Something across Craw's cheek, in his eye, snatched his head away. Blood, blade, dirt, no way of knowing, lurched sideways as something came at him and he slid onto his elbow. Spear, snarling face with a birthmark behind, spear jabbing. Flapped it away clumsily with his shield, trying to scramble up. Scorry stuck the man in the shoulder and he fumbled his spear, wound welling. Wonderful, with blood all over her face. Hers or someone else's, or both. Shivers laughing, smashing the metal rim of his shield into someone's mouth as they lay. Crunch, crunch, die, die. Yon shouting, axe going up and clattering down. Droft stumbling, holding his bloody arm, broken wreck of his bow all tangled around his back. Someone jumped after him with a spear and Craw stepped in his way, head buzzing with his own hoarse roar, sword lashing across. Grip jolted in his fist, cloth and leather flapped, split, bloody. Man's spear dropping, mouth open, long shriek drooling out of it. Craw hacked him down on the backswing, body spinning as it fell, severed arm flopping in his sleeve, black blood frozen in white cloud. Someone was running away down the hill. Arrow flitted past, missed. Craw leapt at him, missed. Tangled with Agric's elbow. Slid and fell hard, dug himself with his sword hilt, left himself open. But the runner didn't care, bounding off, flinging his shield away, bouncing on its edge. Craw tore his sword up along with a handful of grass, nearly swung at someone, stopped himself. Scorry, gripping to his spear. All of Hardbread's lot were running, the ones that were alive. When men break, they break all at once, like a wall falling, like a cliff splitting off into the sea. Broken. Thought he saw Hardbread stumbling after, bloody-mouthed. Half wanted the old bastard to get away, half wanted to charge on and kill him. "Behind! Behind!" He tottered around, fear dragging at his guts, saw men among the stones. There was no shape left to any of it. Sun twinkling bright, blinding. He heard screams, clashing metal. He was running back between the stones, shield clattering against rock, arm numb. Breath wheezing now, aching, coughing and running on. The pack horse was dead beside the fire, arrow poking from its ribs. Shield with a red bird on it, blade rising and falling. Wonderful loosed a shaft, missed. Red Crow turned and ran. A bowman behind shooting an arrow, and it looped over towards Wonderful. Craw stepped in front of it, eyes rooted to it, caught it on his shield, and it glanced away into the tall grass. And they were gone. Agric was looking down at something not far from the fire, staring down, axe in one hand, helmet in the other. Craw didn't want to know what he was looking at, but he already knew. One of Hardbread's lot was crawling away, making the grass thrash as he dragged bloody legs behind it. Shivers walked up and split his head with the back of his axe. Not that hard, but hard enough. Neat, like a practiced miner testing the ground. Someone was still screaming somewhere. Or maybe it was just in Craw's head. Maybe just the sighing breath in his throat. He blinked around. Why the hell had they stayed? He shook his head like it might shake the answer out. Just made his jaw ache worse. "The lake move?" Scorry was asking, squatting down over Brack, sitting on the ground, gripping a bloody hand to one big thigh. "Aye, fucking moves. It just fucking hurts to fucking move it." Craw was sticky with sweat, scratchy, burning hot. His jaw was throbbing where his shield had cracked it, arm throbbing too. Dodgy knee and ankle doing their usual whining, but he didn't seem hurt, not really. Not sure how he'd come out of that not hurt. The hot glow of battle was fading fast, his aching legs shaky as a newborn calf's, his sight swimming. Like he'd borrowed all the strength he'd used and had to pay it back with interest. He took a few steps towards the burned-out fire and the dead pack horse. No sign of the saddle horses, run off or dead. He dropped down on his ass in the middle of the heroes. "You all right?" Wirren was leaning over him, great long sword held below the crosspiece in one fist, blade all spattered and dashed. Blooded, the way it had to be. Once the father of swords is drawn, it has to be blooded. "You all right?" "I reckon." Craw's fingers were so tight around the strap of his shield, he could hardly remember how to make them unclench. Finally forced them open, let the shield drop into the grass, its face showing a few fresh gouges to go with 100 old wounds, a new dent in the dull boss. Wonderful's stubbly hair was matted with blood. "What happened?" Rubbing her eyes on the back of her arm. "Am I cut?" "Scratch," Scorry said, prodding at her scalp with his thumbs. Droft was kneeling beside her, rocking back and forward, gripping tight to his arm, blood streaked to his fingertips. The sun flashed in Craw's eyes, made his lids flicker. He could hear Yon screaming over by the stones, roaring after Hardbread and his lads. "Come back here, you fuckers! Come on, you bastard cowards!" Couldn't make no difference. Every man's a coward and a hero, depending how things stand. They weren't coming back. Looked like they'd left 8 corpses behind. They weren't coming back. Craw prayed to the old dead gods of this place. They weren't coming back. Scorry was singing, soft and low and sad, as he took needle and thread from his pouch to start the stitching. You get no happy songs after a battle. The jaunty tunes come beforehand, and they usually do some injury to the truth. Craw caught himself thinking they'd come out of it well. Very well. Just the one dead. Then he looked at Athrok's silly slack face, eyes all crossed, jerkin all ripped up by Red Crow's axe, and turned sloppy red with his insides, and was sick with himself for thinking it. He knew this would stay with him, along with all the others. We all got our weights to heft. He lay back in the grass and watched the clouds move, shift. Now one memory, now another. A good leader can't dwell on the choices he's made, Three Trees used to tell him. And a good leader can't help dwelling on them. He'd done the right thing. Maybe. Or maybe there's no such thing. Day 1. A rational army would run away. Montesquieu. Silence.
Your August Majesty, Lord Byers, the first of the Magi, has conveyed to Marshal Croy your urgent desire that the campaign be brought to a swift conclusion. The Marshal has therefore devised a plan to bring Black Dow to a decisive battle with all dispatch, and the entire army hums with gainful activity. General Jallenholm's division leads the way, marching from first light to last, and with the vanguard of General Mitterick's but a few hours behind. One could almost say there is a friendly rivalry between the two to be first to grapple with the enemy. Lord Governor Meade, meanwhile, has been recalled from Olensand. The three divisions will converge near a town called Osrum, then, united, drive north towards Carleon itself and victory. I accompany General Jallenholm's staff at the very spear point of the army. We are somewhat hampered by the poor roads and changeable weather, which switches with little warning from sunshine to sharp downpours. The general is not a man to be stopped, however, either by the actions of the skies or the enemy. If we do come into contact with the Northmen, I will of course observe and immediately inform your Majesty of the outcome. I remain your Majesty's most faithful and unworthy servant, Bremedan Gorst, Royal Observer of the Northern War.
You could barely have called it dawn. That funeral grey light before the sun crawls up that has no colour in it. Few faces abroad, and those that were made ghosts. The empty country turned into the land of the dead. Gorst's favourite time of the day. One could almost pretend no one will ever talk again. He had already been running for the best part of an hour, feet battering the rutted mud. Long slits of cartwheel puddle reflected the black tree branches and the washed-out sky. Happy mirror worlds in which he had all he deserved smashed apart as his heavy boots came down, spraying his steel-cased calves with dirty water. It would have been madness to run in full armour, so Gorst wore only the essentials. Breast and back plates with fold to the hip and greaves at the shin. On the right arm, vambrace and fencing glove only, to allow free movement of the sword. On the left, full-jointed steel of the thickest gauge, encasing the parrying arm from fingertips to weighty shoulder plate. A padded jacket beneath, and thick leather trousers reinforced with metal strips. His wobbling window on the world, the narrow slot in the visor of his sallet. A piebald dog yapped wheezily at his heels for a while, its belly grotesquely bloated, but abandoned him to root through a great heap of refuse beside the track. Is our rubbish the only lasting mark we will leave upon this country? Our rubbish and our graves? He pounded through the camp of Jallenholm's division, a sprawling maze of canvas, all in blissful, sleeping silence. Fog clung to the flattened grass, wreathed the closest tents, turned distant ones to phantoms. A row of horses watched him glumly over their nosebags. A lone sentry stood with pale hands stretched out to a brazier, a bloom of crimson colour in the gloom, orange sparks drifting about him. He stared open-mouthed at Gorst as he laboured past and away. His servants were waiting for him in the clearing outside his tent. Rurgen brought a bucket and he drank deep, cold water running down his burning neck. Younger brought the case, straining under the weight, and Gorst slid his practised blades from inside. Great, blunt lengths of battered metal, their pommels big as half-bricks, to lend some semblance of balance, 3 times the weight of his battle steels, which were already of a particularly heavy design. In wonderful silence they came for him, Rurgen with shield and stick, Younger jabbing away with the pole, Gorst struggling to parry with his unwieldy iron. They gave him no time and no chances, no mercy and no respect. He wanted none. He had been given chances before Sipani and allowed himself to grow soft, to grow blunt. When the moment came, he was found wanting. Never again. If another moment came, it would find him forged from steel, sharpened to a merciless, murderous razor's edge. And so, every morning for the last 4 years, every morning since Sipani, every morning without fail, in rain or heat or snow, this. The clonk and scrape of wood on metal, the occasional thud and grunt as sticks bounced off armor or found their marks between. The rhythm of his ripping breath, his pounding heart, his savage effort. The sweat soaking his jacket, tickling his scalp, flying in drops from his visor. The burning in every muscle, worse and worse, better and better, as if he could burn away his disgrace and live again. He stood there, mouth gaping, eyes closed, while they unbuckled his armor. When they lifted the breastplate off, it felt as if he was floating away, off into the sky, never to come down. What is that up there, above the army? Why, none other than famous scapegoat Bremerdan Gorst, freed from the clutching earth at last. He peeled off his clothes, soaked through and reeking, arms so swollen he could hardly bend them. He stood naked in the chill morning, blotched all over with chafe marks, steaming like a pudding from the oven. He gasped with shock when they doused him with icy water, fresh from the stream. Younger tossed him a cloth and he rubbed himself dry. Rurgen brought fresh clothes and he dressed while they scrubbed his armor to its usual workmanlike dull sheen. The sun was creeping over the ragged horizon, and through the gap in the trees, Gorst could see the troopers of the King's Own 1st Regiment wriggling from their tents, breath smoking in the chilly dawn. Buckling on their own armor, poking hopefully at the embers of dead fires, preparing for the morning's march. One group had been drawn yawning up to see one of their fellows whipped for some infringement, the lash leaving faint red lines across his stripped back, its sharp crack reaching Gorst's ear a moment later, followed by the soldier's whimper. He does not realize his luck. If only my punishment had been so short, so sharp, and so deserved. Gorst's battle steels had been made by Calves, greatest swordsmith of Styria, gifts from the king for saving his life at the Battle of Adua. Rurgen drew the long steel from the scabbard and displayed both sides, immaculately polished metal flashing with the dawn. Gorst nodded. His servant showed him the short steel next, edges coldly glittering. Gorst nodded, took the harness and buckled it on. Then he rested one hand on Younger's shoulder, one on Rurgen's, gave them a gentle squeeze and smiled. Rurgen spoke softly, respecting the silence. General Jallenhorm asked that you join him at the head of the column, sir, as soon as the division begins to march. Younger squinted up into the brightening sky. Only 6 miles from Osrung, sir.
Do you think there'll be a battle today?
I hope not.
But by the fates, I hope there is. Oh, please, oh, please, oh, please, I beg you only for this one thing. Send me a battle. Ambition. Finn? He propped himself up on his elbow, grinning down at her. I love you. A pause. She had long ago stopped expecting love to fall upon her like a bolt of lightning. Some people are prone to love of that kind. Others are harder-headed. Finn? Really? I love you. She did love him, even if she somehow found it hard to say the words. Something very close to love. He looked magnificent in a uniform, and even better without one. Sometimes surprised her by making her laugh, and there was definite fire when they kissed. He was honorable, generous, diligent, respectful, good-smelling. No towering intellect, true, but probably that was just as well. There is rarely room for two of those in one marriage. Good boy, she murmured, patting him on his cheek. She had great affection for him, and only occasionally a little contempt, which was better than she could say for most men. They were well matched. Optimist and pessimist, idealist and pragmatist, dreamer and cynic. Not to mention his noble blood and her burning ambition. He gave a disappointed sigh. I swear, every man in the whole damn army loves you. Your commanding officer, Lord Governor Meade? Well, no, probably not him, but I expect even he'd warm to you if you stopped making such a bloody fool of him. If I stopped, he'd only do it to himself. Probably, but men have a higher tolerance for that. There's only one officer whose opinion I give a damn about anyway. He smiled as he traced her ribs with a fingertip. Really? Captain Hardrick. She clicked her tongue. I think it's those very, very tight cavalry trousers of his. I like to drop things so he'll pick them up for me. Oops. She touched her finger to her lip, fluttering her lashes. Curse my clumsiness. I've let fall my fan again. You couldn't just reach for it, could you, Captain? You've almost got it. Only bend a little lower, Captain. Only bend a little lower. Shameless. I don't think Hardrick would suit you at all, though. The man's dull as a plank. You'd be bored in minutes. Finri puffed out her cheeks. You're probably right. A good arse only goes so far. Something most men never realize. Maybe, she thought through her acquaintance for the most ridiculous lover, smiled as she lighted on the perfect candidate. Bremerdan Gorst, then. Can't really say he's got the looks, or the wit, or the standing, but I've a feeling there's a deep well of emotion beneath the lumpen exterior. The voice would take some getting used to, of course, if one could coax out more than 2 words together, but if you like the strong and silent type, I'd say he scores stupendously high on both counts. What? Hal wasn't smiling anymore. I'm joking. I've known him for years. He's harmless. Harmless? Have you ever seen him fight? I've seen him fence. Not quite the same. There was something in the way he was holding back that made her want to know more. Have you seen him fight? Yes. And? And I'm glad he's on our side. She brushed the tip of his nose with a finger. Oh, my poor baby. Are you scared of him? He rolled away from her onto his back. A little. Everyone should be at least a little scared of Bremerden Gorst. That surprised her. She hadn't thought Hal was afraid of anything. They lay there for a moment, the canvas above them flapping gently with the wind outside. Now she felt guilty. She did love Hal. She had marked down all the points the day he proposed, considered all the pros and cons, and categorically proved it to herself. He was a good man, one of the best. Excellent teeth, honest, brave, loyal to a fault. But those things are not always enough. That was why he needed someone more practical to steer him through the rapids. That was why he needed her. Hal? Yes? She rolled towards him, pressing herself against his warm side, and whispered in his ear, I love you. She had to admit to enjoying the power she had over him. That was all it took to make him beam with happiness. Good girl, he whispered, and he kissed her, and she kissed him back, tangling her fingers in his hair. What is love anyway, but finding someone who suits you, someone who makes up for your shortcomings, someone you can work with, work on? Elise Dan Brint was pretty enough, clever enough, and well-born enough not to constitute an embarrassment, but neither pretty enough, clever enough, nor well-born enough to pose any threat. A comparatively narrow band in which Finri felt it was safe to cultivate a friend without danger of being overshadowed. She had never liked being overshadowed. I find it something of a difficult adjustment, murmured Elise, glancing at the column of marching soldiers beside them from beneath her blonde lashes. Being surrounded by men takes some getting used to. I wouldn't know. The army has always been my home. My mother died when I was very young, and my father raised me. I'm sorry. Why? My father misses her, I think, but how can I? I never knew her. An awkward silence. Hardly surprising, since Finri realized that had been the conversational equivalent of a mace to the head. Your parents? Both dead. Oh. That made Finri feel worse. She seemed to spend most conversations seesawing between impatience and guilt. She resolved to be more tolerant, though she did that often, and it never worked. Perhaps she should have resolved simply to keep her mouth shut. But she did that often, too, with even more negligible results. Hooves clapped at the track, tramping boots rumbled in unison, punctuated by the occasional calls of officers, annoyed by some break in the rhythm. We are heading north? Asked Elise. Yes, towards the town of Osrung, to rendezvous with the other two divisions under Generals Jallenhorm and Mitterick. They might be as little as 10 miles from us now, on the other side of those hills. And she gestured towards the lowering fells on their left with her riding crop. What sort of men are they? General Jallenhorm is... Tact. A brave and honest man, an old friend of the king, and promoted far beyond his limited ability as a result. Mitterick is a competent and experienced soldier, as well as a disobedient blowhard with his eyes firmly on her father's position. And each commanding as many men as our own Lord Governor Meade. 7 regiments apiece, 2 of cavalry and 5 of foot. Finri could have reeled off their numbers, titles, and senior officers, but Elise looked as though she was reaching the limits of comprehension as it was. The limits of her comprehension never seemed to be far off, but Finri was determined to make a friend of her even so. Her husband, Colonel Brint, was said to be close to the king himself, which made him a very useful man to know. That was why she always made a point of laughing at his tiresome jokes. So many people, said Elise. Your father certainly carries a great responsibility. He does. The last time Finri had seen her father, she had been shocked by how worn down he seemed. She had always thought of him as cast in iron, and the realization that he might be soft in the middle was most disconcerting. Perhaps that was the moment you grew up, when you learned your parents were just as fallible as everyone else. How many soldiers on the other side? The line between soldier and citizen is not sharply drawn in the north. They have a few thousand carls, perhaps, professional fighters with their own mail and weapons, bred to a life of warfare, who form the spear point of the charge and the front rank in the shield wall. But for each carl there will be several thralls, farmers or tradesmen pressed or paid to fight, and labour, usually lightly armed with spear or bow, but often hardened warriors even so. Then there are named men, veterans who have won a celebrated place through deeds on the battlefield and serve as officers, bodyguards, or scouts in small groups called dozens. Like them. She pointed out a shabby set of the Dogman's men shadowing the column on the ridgeline to their right. I'm not sure anyone knows how many Black Dow has altogether. Probably not even Black Dow does. Elise blinked. You're so knowledgeable. Finri very much wanted to say, yes I am, but settled for a careless shrug. There was no magic to it. She simply listened, observed, and made sure she never spoke until she knew what she was speaking of. Knowledge is the root of power, after all. Elise sighed. War is terrible, isn't it? It blights the landscape, throttles commerce and industry, kills the innocent and rewards the guilty, thrusts honest men into poverty and lines the pockets of profiteers, and in the end produces nothing but corpses, monuments, and tall tales. Finri neglected to mention that it also offered enormous opportunities, however. So many men injured, said Elise. So many dead. An awful thing, though dead men leave spaces into which the nimble-footed can swiftly step, or into which nimble wives can swiftly maneuver their husbands. And all these people, losing their homes, losing everything. Elise was gazing moist-eyed at a miserable procession coming the other way, forced from the track by the soldiers and obliged to toil through their choking dust. They were mostly women, though it was not easy to tell, they were so ragged. Some old men and some children along with them. Northern, certainly. Poor, undoubtedly. Beyond poor, for they had virtually nothing. Their faces pinched with hunger, jaws dangling with exhaustion, clutching at heartbreakingly meagre possessions. They did not look at the Union soldiers tramping the other way with hatred or even with fear. They looked too desperate to register emotion of any kind. Finri did not know who they were running from exactly, or where they were going, what horror had set them in motion, or what others they might still face. Shaken from their homes by the blind tremors of war. Looking at them, Finri felt shamefully secure, revoltingly lucky. It's easy to forget how much you have when your eyes are always fixed on what you have not. Something should be done, murmured Elise wistfully. Finri clenched her teeth. You're right. She gave her horse the spurs, possibly flicking a few specks of mud over Elise's white dress, covered the ground in no time, and slid her mount into the knot of officers that was the frequently misfiring brain of the division. They spoke the language of war up here, timing and supply, weather and morale, rates of march and orders of battle. It was no foreign tongue to Finri, and even as she slipped her horse between them, she noticed mistakes, oversights, inefficiencies. She had been brought up in barracks and mess halls and headquarters, had spent longer in the army than most of the officers here, and knew as much about strategy, tactics, and logistics as any of them. Certainly a great deal more than Lord Governor Meade, who until last year had never presided over anything more dangerous than a formal banquet. He rode at the very centre of the press, under a standard bearing the crossed hammers of Angland, and wearing a magnificent azure uniform rigged with gold braid, better suited to an actor in a tawdry production than a general on campaign. Despite all that money wasted on tailoring, his splendid collars never seemed quite to fit, and his sinewy neck always stuck from them like a turtle's from its shell. He had lost his 3 nephews years ago at the Battle of Blackwell, and his brother, the previous Lord Governor, not long after. He had nursed an insurmountable hatred for Northmen ever since, and been such a keen advocate of war, he had outfitted half his division at his own expense. Hatred of the enemy was no qualification for command, however. Quite the reverse. Lady Brock, how wonderful that you could join us, he said with mild disdain. I was simply taking part in the advance, and you all got in my way. The officers chuckled with, in Hal's case, a slightly desperate note. He gave her a pointed look sideways, and she gave him one back. I and some of the other ladies noticed the refugees on our left. We were hoping you could be prevailed upon to spare them some food. Meade turned his watery eyes on the miserable file with the scorn one might have for a trail of ants. I'm afraid the welfare of my soldiers must come first. Surely these strapping fellows could afford to miss a meal in a good cause. She thumped Colonel Brint's breastplate and made him give a nervous laugh. I have assured Marshal Croy that we will be in position outside Osrung by midnight. We cannot stop. It could be done in... Meade turned rudely away from her. Ladies and their charitable projects, He tossed to his officers, provoking a round of sycophantic laughter. Finri cut through it with a shrill titter of her own. Men and they're playing at war, She slapped Captain Hardrick on the shoulder with her gloves, hard enough to make him wince. What silly, womanly nonsense to try to save a life or two. Now I see it. We should be letting them drop like flies by the roadside, spreading fire and pestilence wherever possible, and leaving their country a blasted wasteland. That will teach them the proper respect for the Union and its ways, I'm sure. There's soldiering. She looked round at the officers, eyebrows raised. At least they had stopped laughing. Meade, in particular, had never looked more humorless, which took some doing. Colonel Brock, he forced through tight lips, I think your wife might be more comfortable riding with the other ladies. I was about to suggest it, said Hal, pulling his horse in front of hers and bringing them both to a sharp halt, while Meade's party carried on up the track. What the hell are you doing? He hissed under his breath. The man's a callous idiot, a farmer playing at soldiers. We have to work with what we have, Finn. Please don't bait him. For me, my bloody nerves won't stand it. I'm sorry. Impatience back to guilt yet again. Not for Meade, of course, but for Hal, who had to be twice as good, twice as brave, and twice as hard-working as anyone else, simply to stay free of his father's suffocating shadow. But I hate to see things done badly on account of some old fool's pride when they could just as easily be done well. Did you consider that it's bad enough having an amateur general without having one who's a bloody laughingstock besides? Maybe with some support he'd do better. Maybe, she muttered, unconvinced. Can't you stay with the other wives? He wheedled. Please, just for now. That prattling coven? She screwed up her face. All they talk about is who's barren, who's unfaithful, and what the Queen's wearing. They're idiots. Have you ever noticed that everyone's an idiot but you? She opened her eyes wide. You see it too. Hal took a hard breath. I love you. You know I do. But think about who you're actually helping. You could have fed those people if you'd trodden softly. He rubbed at the bridge of his nose. I'll talk to the quartermaster, try to arrange something. Aren't you a hero? I try, but bloody hell, you don't make it easy. Next time, for me, please, think about saying something bland. Talk about the weather, maybe. As he rode off back towards the head of the column. Shit on the weather, she muttered at his back. And Meade, too. She had to admit Hal had a point, though. She wasn't doing herself, or her husband, or the Union cause, or even the refugees any good by irritating Lord Governor Meade. She had to destroy him. Give and take. Up you get, old man. Craw was half in a dream still, at home, wherever that was. A young man, or retired. Was it Colwyn smiling at him from the corner? Turning wood on the lathe, curled shavings scattering, crunching under his feet. He grunted, rolled over, pain flaring up his side, stinging him with panic. He tried to rip back his blanket. What the? It's all right. Wonderful had a hand on his shoulder. Thought I'd let you sleep in. She had a long scab down the other side of her head now, stubble hair clumped with dried blood. Thought you could use it.
I could use a few hours yet.
Craw gritted his teeth against 10 different aches as he tried to sit up, first fast, then very, very slow.
Bloody hell, but war's a young man's business.
What's to do? Not much. She handed him a flask, and he sluiced water around his foul mouth and spat.
No sign of hard bread. We buried Athrock.
He paused, flask halfway to his mouth, slowly let it drop. There was a heap of fresh dirt at the foot of one of the stones on the far side of the heroes. Brack and Scorry stood in front of it, shovels in their hands. Agric was between the two, looking down.
You say the words yet?
Asked Craw, knowing they wouldn't have, but still hoping.
Waiting for you.
Good, he lied, and clambered up, gripping to her forearm. It was a grey morning with a nip in the wind, low clouds pawing at the craggy summits of the fells, mist still clinging to the creases in their sides, shrouding the bogs down in the valley's bottom. Craw limped to the grave, shifting his hips, trying to wriggle away from the pain in his joints. He'd rather have gone anywhere else, but there are some things you can't wriggle away from. They were all drifting over there, gathering in a half-circle, all sad and quiet. Droft trying to cram down a whole crust of bread at once, wiping his hands on his shirt. Wirren, with hood drawn up, cuddling the father of swords, like a man might cuddle his sick child. Yon, with a face even grimmer than usual, which took some doing. Craw found his place at the foot of the grave, between Agric and Brack. The hillman's face had lost its usual ruddy glow, the bandage on his leg showing a big fresh stain.
That leg all right?
He asked.
Scratch,
said Brack.
Bleeding a lot for a scratch, innit?
Brack smiled at him, tattoos on his face shifting.
Call that a lot?
Guess not. Not compared to Hardbread's nephew when Wirren cut him in half, anyway. Craw glanced over his shoulder towards where they'd piled the corpses in the lee of the crumbling wall. Out of sight, maybe, but not forgotten. The dead. Always the dead. Craw looked at the black earth, wondering what to say. Looked at the black earth like it had answers in it. But there's nothing in the earth but darkness.
Strange thing.
His voice came out a croak. He had to cough to clear it.
The other day, Droft was asking me whether they call these stones the heroes, 'cause there are heroes buried here. I said not. But maybe there's one buried here now.
Craw winced, saying it, not out of sadness, but 'cause he knew he was talking shit. Stupid shit wouldn't have fooled a child. But the dozen all nodded, Agric with a tear track down his cheek.
Aye,
said Yon. You can say things at a grave would get you laughed out of a tavern and be treated like you're brimming over with wisdom. Craw felt every word was a knife he had to stick in himself, but there was no stopping.
Hadn't been with us long, Athrock, but he made his mark. Won't be forgot.
Craw thought on all the other lads he'd buried, faces and names worn away by the years, and couldn't even guess the number of them.
He stood with his crew. Fought well.
Died badly, hacked with an axe, on ground that meant nothing.
Did the right thing. All you can ask of a man, I reckon. If there's any...
Craw! Shivers was standing maybe 30 strides away on the south side of the circle.
Not now,
he hissed back.
Aye,
said Shivers. Now. Craw hurried over, the grey valley opening up between two of the stones.
What am I looking...
Beyond the river, at the foot of Black Fell, there were horsemen on the brown strip of the Ufrith road, riding fast towards Osrung, smudges of dust rising behind. Could have been 40, could have been more.
And there. Shit.
Another couple of score coming the other way towards the old bridge, taking the crossings, getting around both sides of the heroes. The surge of worry was almost a pain in Craw's chest.
Where's Scary at?
Staring about like he'd put something down and couldn't remember where. Scary was right behind him, holding up one finger. Craw breathed out slow, patting him on the shoulder.
There you are. There you are.
Chief?
Muttered Droft. Craw followed his pointing finger. The road south from Advine, sloping down into the valley from the fold between two fells, was busy with movement. He snapped his eyeglass open and peered towards it.
As the Union.
How many do you reckon?
The wind swept some mist away, and for just a moment, Craw could see the columns stretching back between the hills. Men and metal, spears prickling and flags waving above, stretching back far as he could see.
Looks like all of them,
breathed Wonderful. Brack leaned over.
Tell me we ain't fighting this time.
Craw lowered his eyeglass.
Sometimes the right thing to do is run like fuck. Pack up!
He bellowed.
Right now! We're moving out!
His crew always kept most of their gear stowed, and they were busy packing the rest quick sharp, Scurry with a jaunty marching tune on the go. Jolly Jon was stomping the little fire out with one boot, while Wirren watched, already packed, since all he owned was the Father of Swords, and he had it in one hand.
"Why put it out?"
asked Wirren.
I ain't leaving those bastards my fire,
grunted Jon.
"Don't reckon they'll all be able to fit around it, do you?"
Even so.
"We can't even all fit around it."
Still.
"Who knows? You leave it, maybe one of those Union fellows burns himself and they all get scared and go home."
Jon looked up for a moment, then ground the last embers out under his boot.
I ain't leaving those bastards my fire.
That's it, then?
asked Agric. Craw found it hard to look in his eye. There was something desperate in it.
That's all the words he gets?
"We can say more later, maybe. But for now, there's the living to think on."
We're giving it up.
Agric glared at Shivers, fists clenched, like he was the one killed his brother.
He died for nothing. For a fucking hill we ain't even holding on to. If we hadn't fought, he'd still be alive. You hear that?
He took a step, might have gone for Shivers if Brack hadn't grabbed him from behind, Craw from in front, holding him tight.
"I hear it."
Shivers shrugged, bored.
"And it ain't the first time. If I hadn't gone to Styria, I'd still have both my eyes. I went. One eye. We fought. He died. Life only rolls one way, and it ain't always the way we'd like. There it is."
He turned and strolled off towards the north, axe over his shoulder.
Forget about him,
muttered Craw in Agric's ear. He knew what it was to lose a brother. He'd buried all three of his in one morning.
You need a man to blame. Blame me. I chose to fight. There was no choice, said Brack. It was the right thing to do.
"Where'd Droft get to?"
asked Wonderful, slinging her bow over her shoulder as she walked past.
"Droft? Over here, just packing up."
He was down near the wall, where they'd left the bodies of Hardbread's lot. When Craw got there, he was kneeling by one of them, going through his pockets. He grinned around, holding out a few coins.
"Chief, this one had some..."
He trailed off when he saw Craw's frown.
"I was gonna share it out."
Put it back.
Droft blinked at him.
"But it's no good to him now."
"Ain't yours, is it?"
Leave it there with Hardbread's lad, and when Hardbread comes back, he'll decide who gets it.
More than likely it'll be Hardbread gets it,
muttered Jon, coming up behind with his mail draped over his shoulder.
Maybe it will be, but it won't be any of us. There's a right way of doing things.
That got a couple of sharp breaths and something close to a groan.
"No one thinks that way these days, Chief,"
said Scurry, leaning on his spear.
Look how rich some no-mark like Soot Brittles made himself, said Brack. while we scrape by on a piss-pot staple and the odd guild, growled Jon.
That's what you're due, and I'll see you get a guild for yesterday's work, but you'll leave the bodies be. You want to be Sut Brittle, you can beg a place with Glamour Golden's lot and rob folk all day long. Craw wasn't sure what was making him so prickly. He'd let it pass before, helped himself more than once when he was younger. Even Three Trees used to overlook his boys picking a corpse or two. But prickly he was, and now he'd chosen to stand on it, he couldn't back down. What are we? He snapped. Named men or pickers and thieves?
Poor is what we are, Chief,
said Jon.
and starting to...
What the fuck? Wonderful slapped the coins from Droft's hand and sent them scattering into the grass. When you're chief, Jolly Jon Cumber, you can do it your way. Till then, we'll do it Craw's. We're named men. Or I am, at least. I ain't convinced about the rest of you. Now move your fat arses before you end up bitching to the Union about your poverty. We ain't in this for the coin, said Wirren, ambling past with the Father of Swords over his shoulder. Jon gave him a dark look.
You might not be cracking up. Some of us wouldn't mind a little from time to time.
But he walked off, shaking his head, mail jingling, and Brack and Scorry shrugged at each other, then followed. Wonderful leaned close to Craw. Sometimes I think the more other folk don't care a shit, the more you think you've got to. Your point? Can't make the world a certain way all on your own. There's a right way of doing things, he snapped. You sure the right way isn't just trying to keep everyone happy and alive? The worst thing was that she had a point. Is that where we've come to now? I thought that's about where we've always been. Craw raised a brow at her. You know what? That husband of yours really should teach you some respect. That bitch? He's almost as scared of me as you lot. Let's go. She pulled Droft up by his elbow, and the dozen made their way through the gap in the wall, moving fast. Or as fast as Craw's knees would go. They headed north, down the ragged track the way they'd come, and left the heroes to the Union. Craw worked his way through the trees, chewing at the fingernails of his sword hand. He'd already gnawed his shield hand down to his knuckles, more or less. Damn things never grew back fast enough. He'd felt less scared on the way up the heroes at night than he did going to tell Black Dow he'd lost a hill. Can't be right when you're less scared of the enemy than your own chief, can it? He wished he had some friendly company, but if there was going to be blame, he wanted to shoulder it alone. He'd made the choices. The woods were crawling with men thick as ants in the grass. Black Dow's own carls, veterans, cold-headed and cold-hearted, and with lots of cold steel to share out. Some had plate armor like the Union wore, others strange weapons, beaked, picked and hooked for punching through steel, all manner of savage inventions new to the world that the world was more unlikely better off without. He doubted any of these would be thinking twice before robbing a few coins off the dead, or the living either. Craw had been most of his life a fighting man, but crowds of them still somehow made him nervous, and the older he got, the less he felt he fit. Any day now they'd spot him for a fraud, realize that keeping his threadbare courage stitched together was harder work every morning. He winced as his teeth bit into the quick and jerked his nails away. Can't be right, he muttered to himself. A named man to be scared all the time. What? Craw had almost forgotten Shivers was there. He moved so silently. You get scared, Shivers? A pause, that eye of his glinting as the sun peeked through the branches. Used to. All the time. What changed? Got my eye burned out of my head. So much for calming small talk. Reckon that could change your outlook. Halves it. Some sheep were bleating away beside the track, pressed tight into a pen much too small. Foraged, no doubt, meaning stolen. Some unlucky shepherd's livelihood vanished down the gullets and out the arses of Black Dow's army. Behind a screen of hides, not 2 strides from the flock, a woman was slaughtering them, and 3 more doing the skinning and gutting and hanging the carcasses, all soaked to the armpits in blood and not caring much about it either. 2 lads, probably just reached fighting age, were watching, laughing at how stupid the sheep were not to guess what was happening behind those hides. They didn't see that they were in the pen, and behind a screen of songs and stories and young men's dreams, war was waiting, soaked to the armpits and not caring. Craw saw it all well enough. So why was he still sitting meek in his pen? Might be old sheep can't jump new fences either. The black standard of the Protector of the North was dug into the earth outside some ivy-wrapped ruin, long ago conquered by the forest. More men busy in the clearing before it, and stirring horses tethered in long roads. A grindstone being peddled, metal shrieking, sparks spraying. A woman hammering at a cartwheel. A smith working at a hawbuck, with pincers and a mouthful of mail rings. Children hurrying about with armfuls of shafts, slopping buckets on yokes, sacks of the dead knew what. A complicated business, violence, once the scale gets big enough. A man sprawled on a stone slab, oddly at ease in the midst of all this work that made nothing. On his elbows, head tipped back, eyes closed. Body all in shadow, but a chink of sun from between the branches coming down across his smirk, so it was bathed in double brightness. By the dead! Craw walked to him and stood looking down. If it ain't the Prince of Nothing Much. Those women's boots you're wearing. Styrian leather. Calder's lids drifted open a slit. That curl to his lip he'd had since a boy. Kerndon Craw. You still alive, you old shit? Bit of a cough as it goes. He hawked up and spat phlegm onto the old stone between Calder's fancy foot leather. Reckon I'll survive, though. Who made the mistake of letting you crawl back from exile? Calder swung his legs off the slab. None other than the great Protector himself. Guess he couldn't beat the Union without my mighty sword arm. What's his plan? Cut it off and throw it at him? Calder spread his arms out wide. How would I hold you, then? And they folded each other tight. Good to see you, you stupid old fool. Likewise, you lying little fuck. Shivers frowned from the shadows all the while. You two seem tight, he muttered. Why, I practically raised this little bastard. Craw scrubbed Calder's hair with his knuckles. Fed him milk from a squeezed cloth, I did. Closest thing I ever had to a mother, said Calder. Shivers nodded slowly. Explains a lot. We should talk. Calder gave Craw's arm a squeeze. I miss our talks. And me. Craw took a careful step back as a horse reared nearby, knocked its cart sideways, and sent a tangle of spears clattering to the ground. Almost as much as I miss a decent bed. Today might not be the day, though. Maybe not. I hear there's some sort of battle about to happen. Calder backed off, throwing up his hands. It's going to kill my whole afternoon. He passed a cage as he went, a couple of filthy Northmen squatting naked inside, one sticking an arm out through the bars in hopes of water, or mercy, or just so some part of him could be free. Deserters would have been hanged already, which made these thieves or murderers. Waiting on Black Dow's pleasure, which was more than likely going to be to hang 'em anyway, and probably burn 'em into the bargain. Strange to lock men up for thieving when the whole army lived on robbery. To dangle men for murder when they were all at the business of killing. What makes a crime in a time when men take what they please from who they please? Doe wants you. Splitfoot stood frowning in the ruin's archway. He'd always been a dour bastard, but he looked specially put upon today. In there. You want my sword? Craw was already sliding it out. No need. No? When did Black Dow start trusting people?
Not people, just you.
Craw wasn't sure if that was a good sign.
All right, then.
Shivers made to follow, but Splitfoot held him back with one hand.
Dow didn't ask for you.
Craw caught Shivers' narrowed eye for a moment and shrugged and ducked through the ivy-choked archway, feeling like he was sticking his head in a wolf's mouth and wondering when he'd hear the teeth snap. Down a passage hung with cobweb, echoing with dripping water, into a wide stretch of brambly dirt, broken pillars scattered around its edge, some still holding up a crumbling vault, but the roof long gone and the clouds above starting to show some bright blue between. Dow sat in Scarling's chair at the far end of the ruined hall, toying with the pommel of his sword. Call Ricci sat near him, scratching at his white stubble.
When I give the word, Dow was saying, you'll lead off alone. Move on Ostrom with everything you got. They're weak there. How do you know that?
Dow winked.
I got my ways. They've too many men and not enough road. And they rushed to get here, so they're stretched out thin. Just some horsemen in the town and a few of the dogman's lads. Might have got some foot up there by the time we go, but not enough to stop you if you take a proper swing at it.
Oh, I'll swing at it, said Ricci.
Don't worry on that score. I'm not. That's why you're leading off. I want your lads to carry my standard, nice and clear up at the front. And Golden's, and Ironhead's, and yours, where everyone can see. Make 'em think it's our big effort. Any luck, they'll pull some men off from the heroes, leave the stones weaker held. Once they're in the open fields between hill and town, I'll let slip Golden's boys and he'll tear their asses out. Meantime, me and Ironhead and Ten Ways will make the proper effort on the heroes. How do you plan to work it?
Dow flashed that hungry grin of his.
Run up that hill and kill everything living. They'll have had time to get set, and that's some tough ground to charge. It's where they'll be strongest. We could go around. Strongest here.
Dow dug his sword into the ground in front of Scarling's chair.
Weakest here.
And he tapped at his chest with a finger.
We've been going around the sides for months. They won't be expecting us front on. We break 'em at the heroes, we break 'em here.
And he thumped his chest again.
And the rest all crumbles. Then Golden can follow up, chase 'em right across the fords if need be, all the way to Advine. Scale should be ready on the right by then, can take the old bridge. With you in Osrung in wait, when the rest of the Union turn up tomorrow, all the best ground will be ours.
Ricci slowly stood.
Right you are, Chief. We'll make it a red day. A day for the songs. Shit on the songs, said Dow, standing himself. I'll take just victory.
They clasped hands a moment, then Ricci moved for the entrance, saw Craw, and gave a big gap-toothed smile.
Old Call Ricci.
And Craw held out his hand.
Kerndon Craw, as I live and breathe.
Ricci folded it in one of his, then slapped the other down on top.
Ain't enough of us good men left. Those are the times. How's the knee? You know, it is how it is. Mine too. Yon Cumber, always with a joke ready. How's Flood getting on?
Ricci grinned.
Got him looking after some new recruits. Right shower of pisswater in the main. Maybe they'll shape up. They better add, and fast. I hear we got a battle coming.
Ricci clapped him on the arm as he passed.
Be waiting for your order, Chief.
And he left Craw and Black Dow watching each other over a few strides of rubble-strewn, weed-sprouting, nettle-waving old mud. Birds twittered, leaves rustled, the hint of distant metal serving notice there was bloody business due.
Chief?
Craw licked his lips, no idea how this was going to go. Dow took a long breath in and screamed at the top of his voice,
Didn't I tell you to hold on to that fucking hill?
Craw went cold as the echoes rang from the crumbling walls. Looked like it might not go well at all. He wondered if he might find himself stripped in a cage before sundown.
Well, I was holding on to it all right, until the Union showed up.
Dow came closer, sheathed sword still in one fist. and Craw had to make himself not back off. Dow leaned forwards, and Craw had to make himself not flinch. Dow raised one hand and put it gently down on Craw's sore shoulder, and he had to make himself not shudder.
"Sorry about this," said Dow quietly, "but I've a reputation to look to."
A wave of giddy relief.
Of course, Chief. Let rip.
He narrowed his eyes as Dow took another breath.
"You useless old limping fuck!"
Spraying Craw with spit, then patting the bruised side of his face none too gently.
"You made a fight of it, then?"
Aye, with hard bread and a few of his lads.
I remember that old bastard. How many did he have?
22.
Dow bared his teeth somewhere between smile and scowl.
And you? What, 10? Aye, with shivers. And you saw him off? Well, wish I'd fucking been there.
Dow twitched with violence, eyes fixed on nothing, like he could see Hardbread and his boys coming up that slope, and they couldn't come fast enough for him.
"Wish I'd been there!"
And he lashed out with the pommel of his sheathed sword and struck splinters from the nearest pillar, making Craw take a careful step back.
"Instead of sitting back here fucking talking, fucking talking."
Dow spat and took a breath, then seemed to remember Craw was there, eyes sliding back towards him.
You saw the Union come up. At least 1,000 on the road to Advine, and I got the feeling there were more behind.
Jallanholm's division, said Dow.
How'd you know that?
He has his ways. By the... Craw took a startled pace, got his feet caught in a bramble and nearly fell. There was a woman lying on one of the highest walls, draped over it like a wet cloth, one arm and one leg dangling, head hanging over the side like she was resting on some garden bench instead of a tottering heap of masonry 6 strides above the dirt. Friend of mine. Dow didn't even look up. Well, when I say friend...
"Enemy's enemy."
She rolled off the back of the wall. Craw stared, waiting for the sound of her hitting the ground.
"I am Ishri,"
the voice whispered in his ear. This time he went right on his arse in the dirt. She stood over him, skin black and smooth and perfect, like the glazing on a good pot. She wore a long coat, tails dragging on the dirt, hanging open, body all bound in white bandages underneath. If anyone ever looked like a witch, she was it. Not that there was much more evidence of witchery needed, past vanishing from one place and stepping out of another. Dow barked with laughter.
"You never can tell where she'll spring from. I'm always worried she'll pop out of nowhere while I'm,
And he mimed a wanking action with one fist.
"You wish,"
said Ishri, looking down at Craw with eyes blacker than black, unblinking, like a jackdaw staring at a maggot.
"Where did you come from?"
muttered Craw as he scrambled up, hopping a little on account of his stiff knee.
"South,"
she said, though that much was clear enough from her skin.
"Or do you mean, why did I come?"
I'll take why.
"To do the right thing."
There was a faint smile on her face at that.
"To fight against evil. To strike mighty blows for righteousness. Or do you mean, who sent me?"
All right, who sent you?
"God."
Her eyes rolled to the sky, framed by jutting weeds and saplings.
"And how could it be otherwise? God puts us all where he wants us."
Craw rubbed at his knee.
Got a shitty sense of humor, don't he?
"You do not know the half of it. I came to fight against the Union. Is that enough?"
It's enough for me, said Dow. Ishri's black eyes flicked away to him, and Craw felt greatly relieved.
"They are moving onto the hill in numbers."
Jallanholm's lot?
"I believe so."
She stretched up tall, wriggling all over the place like she had no bones in her. Reminded Craw of the eels they used to catch from the lake near his workshop, spilling from the net, squirming in the children's hands and making them squeal.
You fat pink men all look the same to me.
What about Mitrick? Asked Dow. Her bony shoulders drifted up and down.
Some way behind, chomping at the bit, furious that Jallenhorn is in his way.
Mead?
Where is the fun in knowing everything?
She pranced past Craw, up on her toes, almost brushing against him, so he had to nervously step back and nearly trip again.
God must be so bored.
She wedged one foot into a crack in the wall, too narrow for a cat to squeeze through, twisting her leg, somehow working it in up to the hip.
Do it then, my heroes.
She writhed like a worm cut in half, wriggling into the ruined masonry, her coat dragging up the mossy stonework behind her.
Do you not have a battle to fight?
Her skull somehow slid into the gap, then her arms. She clapped her bandaged hands once, and just a finger was left sticking from the crack. Dow walked over to it, reached out, and snapped it off. It wasn't a finger at all, just a dead bit of twig.
Magic, muttered Craw. Can't say I care for the stuff.
In his experience, it did more harm than good.
I dare say as sorcerers got their uses and all, but, I mean, do they always have to act so bloody strange?
Dow flicked the twig away with a wrinkled lip.
It's a war. I care for whatever gets the job done.
Best not mention my black-skinned friend to anyone else, though, eh? Folks might get the wrong idea.
What's the right idea?
Whatever I fucking say it is, snarled Dow, and he didn't look like he was faking the anger this time. Craw held up his open hands.
You're the chief?
Damn right. Dow frowned at that crack.
I'm the chief.
Almost like it was himself he was trying to convince. Just for a moment, Craw wondered whether Black Dow ever felt like a fraud, whether Black Dow's courage needed stitching together every morning. He didn't like that thought much.
We're fighting, then?
Dow's eyes swiveled sideways, and his killing smile broke out fresh. No trace of doubt in it, or fear neither.
I fucking tie him, though. You hear what I was telling Ricci? Most of it. He'll try and draw him off towards Osrung, then you'll go straight at the heroes.
Straight at 'em, barked Dow, like he could make it work by shouting it. The way Three Trees would have done it, eh?
Would he?
Dow opened his mouth, then paused.
What does it matter? 3 trees is 7 winters in the mud.
True. Where do you want me and my dozen?
Right beside me when I charge up to the heroes, of course. Expect there's nothing in the world you'd like more than to take that hill back from those Union bastards.
Craw gave a long sigh, wondering what his dozen would have to say about that.
Oh, aye. It's top of my list.
The very model.
An officer should command from horseback, Ghost. The proper place for a headquarters is the saddle.
General Jallenhorn affectionately patted the neck of his magnificent grey, then leaned over without waiting for an answer to roar at a spotty-faced courier.
Tell the captain that he must simply clear the road by whatever means necessary. Clear the road and move them up. Haste, all haste, lad. Marshal Croy wants the division moving north.
He swiveled to bellow over the other shoulder.
Speed, gentlemen, speed! Towards Carlion and victory!
Jallenhorn certainly looked a conquering hero, fantastically young to command a division, and with a smile that said he was prepared for anything, dressed with an admirable lack of pretension in a dusty trooper's uniform, and as comfortable in the saddle as a favourite armchair. If he had been half as fine a tactician as he was a horseman, they would long ago have had Black Dow in chains and on public display in Adua. But he is not, and we do not. A constantly shifting body of staff officers, adjutants, liaisons, and even a scarcely pubescent bugler trailed eagerly along in the general's wake, like wasps after a rotten apple, fighting to attract his fickle attention by snapping, jostling, and shouting over one another with small dignity. Meanwhile, Jallenhorm himself barked out a volley of confusing and contradictory replies, questions, orders, and occasional musings on life.
On the right, of course,
to one officer.
Tell him not to worry. Worrying solves nothing,
to another.
Move them up. Marshal Croy wants them all up by lunch.
A large body of infantry were obliged to shuffle exhausted from the road, watch the officers pass, then chew on their dust.
Beef, then,
bellowed Jallenhorm with a regal wave.
Or mutton, whichever. We have more important business. Will you come up the hill with me, Colonel Ghost? Apparently one gets quite the view from the heroes. You are His Majesty's observer, are you not?
I am His Majesty's fool. Almost as much His Majesty's fool as you are.
Yes, General.
Jallenhorm had already whisked his mount from the road and down the shingle towards the shallows, pebbles scattering. His hangers-on strained to follow, splashing out into the water and heedlessly showering a company of heavily loaded foot who were struggling across up to their waists in the river. The hill rose out of the fields on the far side, a great green cone so regular as to seem artificial. The circle of standing stones that the Northmen called the Heroes jutted from its flat top, a much smaller circle on a spur to the right, a single tall needle of rock on another to the left. Orchards grew on the far bank, the twisted trees heavy with reddening apples, thin grass underneath patched with shade and covered in half-rotten windfalls. Jallenhorm leaned out to pluck one from a low-hanging branch and happily bit into it.
Yuck!
He shuddered and spat it out.
Cookers, I suppose. General Jallenhorm, sir!
A breathless messenger whipping his horse down one row of trees towards them.
Speak, man!
Without slowing from a trot.
Major Calf is at the Old Bridge, sir, with 2 companies of the 14th. He wonders whether he should push forward to a nearby farm and establish a perimeter.
Absolutely. Forward. We need to make room. Where are the rest of his companies?
The messenger had already saluted and galloped off westwards. Jallenhorm frowned around at his staff.
Major Calf's other companies? Where's the rest of the 14th?
Dappled sunlight slid over baffled faces. An officer opened his mouth, but said nothing. Another shrugged.
Perhaps held up in Advine, sir. There is considerable confusion on the narrow roads.
He was interrupted by another messenger, bringing a well-lathered horse from the opposite direction.
Sir, Colonel Winkler wishes to know whether he should turn the residents of Osrung out of their houses and garrison.
No, turn them out, no.
Sir,
the young man pulled his horse about.
Wait! Yes, turn them out. Garrison the houses. Wait! No. Hearts and minds, Colonel Ghost. Hearts and minds, don't you think? What do you think?
I think your close friendship with the king has caused you to be promoted far beyond the rank at which you were most effective. I think you would have made an excellent lieutenant, a passable captain, a mediocre major, and a dismal colonel. But as a general, you are a liability. I think you know this, and have no confidence, which makes you behave paradoxically as if you have far too much. I think you make decisions with little thought, abandon some with none, and stick furiously to others against all argument, thinking that to change your mind would be to show weakness. I think you fuss with details better left to subordinates, fearing to tackle the larger issues, and that makes your subordinates smother you with decisions on every trifle, which you then bungle. I think you are a decent, honest, courageous man, and I think you are a fool.
Hearts and minds,
said Gorst. Jallenhorm beamed. The messenger tore off, presumably to win the people of Osrung to the Union cause by allowing them to keep their own houses. The rest of the officers emerged from the shade of the apple trees and into the sun, the grassy slope stretching away above them.
With me, boys! With me!
Jallenhorm urged his charger uphill, maintaining an effortless balance in the saddle, while his retainers struggled to keep up, one balding captain almost torn from his seat as a low branch clubbed him in the head. An old dry stone wall ringed the hill not far from the top, sprouting with seeding weeds, no higher than a stride or two even on its outside face. One of the more impetuous young ensigns tried to show off by jumping it, but his horse shied and nearly dumped him. A fitting metaphor for the Union involvement in the North so far. A lot of vain glory, but it all ends in embarrassment. Jallenhorm and his officers passed in file through a narrow gap, the ancient stones on the summit looming larger with every hoofbeat, then rearing over Gorst and the rest as they crested the hill's flat top. It was close to midday. The sun was high and hot. The morning mists were all burned off, and, aside from some towers of white cloud casting ponderous shadows over the forests to the north, the valley was bathed in golden sunlight. The wind made waves through the crops, the shallows glittered, a Union flag snapped proudly over the tallest tower in the town of Osrung. To the south of the river, the roads were obscured by the dust of thousands of marching men, the occasional twinkle of metal showing where bodies of soldiers moved, infantry, cavalry, supplies, rolling sluggishly from the south. Jallenhorm had drawn his horse up to take in the view, and with some displeasure.
We aren't moving fast enough, damn it! Major? Sir? I want you to ride down to Advine and see if you can hurry them along there. We need to get more men on this hill, more men into Osrung. We need to move them up. Sir? And Major? Sir?
Jallenhorm sat, open-mouthed for a moment.
Never mind. Go.
The man set off in the wrong direction, realized his error, and was gone down the hill the way they had come. Confusion reigned in the wide circle of grass within the heroes. Horses had been tethered to two of the stones, but one had got loose and was making a deafening racket, scaring the others and kicking out alarmingly, while several terrified grooms tried desperately to snatch its bridle. The standard of the King's own 6th Regiment hung limp in the centre of the circle beside a burned-out fire, where, utterly dwarfed by the sullen slabs of rock that surrounded it on every side, it did little for morale. Although, let us face the facts, my morale is beyond help. 2 small wagons that had somehow been dragged up the hill had been turned over onto their sides, and their eclectic contents, from tents to pans to smithing instruments to a shining new washboard, scattered across the grass while soldiers rooted through the remainder like plunderers after a rout.
What the hell are you about, Sergeant?
Demanded Jallenhorm, spurring his horse over. The man looked up guiltily to see the attention of a general and 24 staff officers all suddenly focused upon him, and swallowed.
Well, sir, we're a little short of flatbow bolts, General, sir. And it seems ammunition was considered very important by those that packed the supplies. Naturally. So it was packed first. First? Yes, sir. Meaning on the bottom, sir. The bottom? Sir.
A man with a pristine uniform hastened over, chin high, giving Jallenhorm a salute so sharp that the snapping of his well-polished heels was almost painful to the ear. The general swung from his saddle and shook him by the hand.
Colonel Wetterland, good to see you. How do things stand?
Well enough, sir. Most of the 6th is up here now, though lacking a good deal of our equipment.
Wetterland led them across the grass, soldiers doing the best they could to make room amid the chaos.
1 battalion of the Rostod Regiment, too, though what happened to their commanding officer is anyone's guess.
Laid up with the gout, I believe,
someone muttered.
Is that a grave? Asked Jallenhorm, pointing out a patch of fresh-turned earth in the shadow of one of the stones, trampled with boot prints. The colonel frowned at it. Well, I suppose. Any sign of the Northmen? A few of my men have seen movement in the woods to the north, but nothing we could say for certain was the enemy. More likely than not, it's sheep. Wetterland led them between two of the towering stones. Other than that, not a sniff of the buggers, apart from what they left behind, that is. Ah, said one of the staff officers, looking sharply away. Several blood-stained bodies were laid out in a row. One of them had been sliced in half and had lost his lower arm besides, flies busy on his exposed innards. Was there combat? Asked Jallenhorm, frowning at the corpses. No, those are yesterday's, and they were ours. Some of the Dogman's scouts, apparently. The colonel pointed out a small group of Northmen, a tall one with a red bird on his shield and a heavy-set old man conspicuous among them, busy digging graves. What about the horse? It lay on its side, an arrow poking from its bloated belly. I really couldn't say. Gorst took in the defences, which were already considerable. Spearmen were manning the dry stone wall on this side of the hill, packed shoulder to shoulder at a gap where a patchy track passed down the hillside. Behind them, higher up the slope, a wide double curve of archers fussed with bolts and flat bows, or simply lazed about, chewing disconsolately at dried rations, a couple apparently arguing over winnings at dice. Good, said Jallenhorm. Good, without specifying exactly what met his approval. He frowned out across the patchwork of field and pasture, over the few farms, and towards the woods that blanketed the north side of the valley. Thick forest, of the kind that covered so much of the country, the monotony of trees only relieved by the vague stripes of two roads leading north between the fells. One of them, presumably, to Carleon, and victory. There could be 10 Northmen out there, or 10,000, muttered Jallenhorm. We must be careful. Mustn't underestimate Blackdow. I was at the Cumnor, you know, Ghost, where Prince Ladislaw was killed. Well, the day before the battle, in fact, but I was there. A dark day for Union arms. Can't be having another of those, eh? I strongly suggest that you resign your commission, then, and allow someone with better credentials to take command.
No, sir.
Jallenhorm had already turned away to speak to Wetterland. Gorst could hardly blame him. When did I last say anything worth hearing? Bland agreements and non-committal splutterings. The bleating of a goat would serve the same purpose. He turned his back on the knot of staff officers and wandered over to where the Northmen were digging graves. The grey-haired one watched him come, leaning on his spade.
My name is Gorst.
The older man raised his brows, surprised that a Union man should speak Northern, or surprised that a big man should speak like a little girl.
Hardbread's mine. I fight for the Dogman.
His words slightly mangled in a badly matted mouth. Gorst nodded to the corpses.
These are your men?
Aye.
You fought up here?
Against a dozen, led by a man called Kerndon Craw.
He rubbed at his bruised jaw.
We had the numbers, but we lost.
Gorst frowned around the circle of stones.
They had the ground.
That, and Wirren of Bly.
Who?
Some fucking hero, scoffed the one with the red bird on his shield. From way up north in the valleys, said Hardbread, where it snows every bloody day. Mad bastard, grunted one of Hardbread's men, nursing a bandaged arm. They say he drinks his own piss. I heard he eats children. He has this sword, they say, fell out of the sky.
Hardbread wiped his forehead on the back of one thick forearm.
They worship it up there in the snows.
They worship a sword?
Asked Gorst.
They think God dropped it or something. Who knows what they think up there? Either way, Cracknut Wirren is one dangerous bastard.
Hardbread licked at a gap in his teeth, and from his grimace it was a new one.
can tell you that from my own experience.
Gorst frowned towards the forest, trees shining dark green in the sun.
Do you think Blackthorn's men are near?
I reckon they are.
Why?
Because Crow fought against the odds, and he ain't a man to fight over nothing. Black Dow wanted this hill.
Hardbread shrugged as he bent back to his task.
We're burying these poor bastards, then we're going down. I'll be leaving a tooth back there on the slope, and a nephew in the mud, and I don't plan on leaving aught else in this bloody place.
Thank you.
Gorst turned back towards Jallenhorm and his staff, now engaged in a heated debate about whether the latest company to arrive should be placed behind or in front of the ruined wall.
General,
He called.
the scouts think Black Dow might be nearby.
I hope he is.
Shot back Jallenhorm, though it was obvious he was scarcely listening.
The crossings are in our hands. Take control of all 3 crossings. That's our first objective.
I thought there were 4 crossings.
It was said quietly, one man murmuring to another, but the hubbub dropped away at that moment. Everyone turned to see a pale young lieutenant, somewhat surprised to have become the centre of attention.
4?
Jallenhorm rounded on the man.
There is the old bridge to the west.
He flung out one arm, almost knocking down a portly major.
The bridge in Ostrom to the east, and the shallows where we made the passage. 3 crossings.
The general waved 3 big fingers in the lieutenant's face.
All in our hands.
The young man flushed.
One of the scouts told me there is a path through the bogs, sir, further west of the old bridge. A path through the bogs?
Jallenhorm squinted off to the west.
A secret way? I mean to say, Northmen could use that path and get right around us. Damn good work, boy.
Well, thank you, sir.
The general spun one way, then back the other, heel twisting up the sod, casting around, as though the right strategy was always just behind him.
Who hasn't crossed the river yet?
His officers milled about in their efforts to stay in his line of sight.
Are the 8th up? I thought the rest of the 13th.
Colonel Valamir's 1st Cavalry are still deploying there.
I believe they have 1 battalion in order, just reunited with their horses. Excellent. Send to Colonel Valamir and ask him to take that battalion through the bogs.
A couple of officers grumbled their approval. Others glanced somewhat nervously at each other. "A whole battalion," one muttered. "Is this path suitable for—" Jallenhorm swatted them away.
Colonel Gorst, would you ride back across the river and convey my wishes to Colonel Valamir? Make sure the enemy can't give us an unpleasant surprise.
Gorst paused for a moment.
General, I would prefer to remain where I can...
I understand entirely. You wish to be close to the action. But the king asked specifically in his last letter that I do everything possible to keep you out of danger. Don't worry, the front line will hold perfectly well without you. We friends of the king must stick together, mustn't we?
All the king's fools, capering along in military motley to the same mad bugle music. Make the one with the silly voice turn another cartwheel. My sides are splitting.
Of course, sir.
And Gorst trudged back towards his horse. Scales. Calder nudged his horse down a path so vague he wasn't even sure it was one. Smirk clamped tight to his face. If Deep and Shallow were keeping an eye on him, and since he was their best source of money, it was a certainty, he couldn't tell. Admittedly, there wasn't much point to men like Deep and Shallow if a man like Calder could tell where they were, but by the dead he would have liked some company. Like a starving man tossed a crust, seeing Kerndon Craw had only whetted Calder's appetite for friendly faces. He'd ridden through Ironhead's men, soaking up their scorn, and Tenway's, soaking up their hostility, and now he was getting into the woods at the west end of the valley where Scales' men were gathered. His brother's men. His men, he supposed, though they didn't feel much like his. Tough-looking bastards, ragged from hard marching, bandaged from hard fighting, worn down from being far from Black Dow's favour, where they did the toughest jobs for the leanest rewards. They didn't look in a mood to celebrate anything, and for damn sure not the arrival of their chief's coward brother. It didn't help that he'd struggled into his chainmail shirt, hoping to at least look like a warrior prince for the occasion. It had been a gift from his father years ago, made from Styrian steel, lighter than most northern mixtures, but still heavy as an anvil and hot as a sheepskin. Calder had no notion how men could wear these damn things for days at a time. Run in them, sleep in them, fight in them. Mad business, fighting in this. Mad business, fighting. He'd never understood what men saw in it. And few men saw more in it than his own brother Scale. He was squatting in a clearing with a map spread out in front of him. Pale as snow was at his left elbow, and White-Eye Hansel at his right, old comrades of Calder's father from the time when he ruled the best part of the north. Men who'd fallen a long way when the Bloody Nine threw Calder's father from his battlements, almost as far as Calder had fallen himself. Him and Scale were born to different mothers, and the joke always was that Scales must have been a bull. He looked like a bull, and a particularly mean and muscular one at that. He was Calder's opposite in almost every way. Blonde where Calder was dark, blunt-featured where Calder was sharp, quick to anger and slow to think. Nothing like their father. Calder was the one who'd taken after Bethod, and everyone knew it. One reason why they hated him. That, and he'd spent so much of his life acting like a prick. Scale looked up when he heard the hooves of Calder's horse, gave a great smile as he strode over, still carrying that trace of a limp the Bloody Nine had given him. He wore his chainmail lightly as a maiden wears a shift, even so. A heavy, black-forged double coat of it, plates of black steel strapped on top, all scratched and dented. Always be armed, their father had told them, and Scale had taken it literally. He was crisscrossed with belting and bristling with weapons, 2 swords and a great mace at his belt, 3 knives in plain sight, and probably others out of it. He had a bandage around his head stained brown on one side, and a new nick through his eyebrow to add to a rapidly growing collection of scars. It looked as if Calder's frequent attempts to persuade Scale to stay out of battle had been as wasted as Scale's frequent attempts to persuade Calder to charge into it. Calder swung from his saddle, finding it a straining effort in his mail, and trying to make it look like he was only stiff from a hard ride. "Scale, you thick bastard! How have you—" Scale caught him in a crushing hug, lifted his feet clear of the ground, and gave him a slobbery kiss on the forehead. Calder hugged him back the best he could, with all the breath squeezed out of his body and a sword hilt poking him in the gut, so suddenly, pathetically happy to have someone on his side, he wanted to cry. "Get off!" he wheezed, hammering at Scale's back with the heel of his hand like a wrestler submitting. "Off! Just good to see you back!" And Scale spun him helplessly around like a husband with his new bride, gave him a fleeting view of Pale as Snow and White-Eye Hansel. Neither of them looked like hugging Calder any time soon. The eyes on him from the named men scattered about the clearing were no more enthusiastic. Men he recognized from way back, kneeling to his father, or sitting at the long table, or cheering victory in the good old days. No doubt they were wondering whether they'd have to take Calder's orders now, and not much caring for the idea. Why would they? Scale was all those things warriors admired. Loyal, strong, brave beyond the point of stupidity. Calder was none of them, and everyone knew it. "What happened to your head?" he asked, once Scale had let his feet touch earth again. "This? Ah, nothing." Scale tore the bandage off and tossed it away. It didn't look like nothing, his yellow hair matted brown with dry blood on one side. "Seems you've a wound of your own, though," patting Calder's bruised lip none too gently. "Some woman bite you?" "If only. About 10 ways tried to have me killed." "What?"
Really, he sent 3 men after me to call Ricci's camp. Luckily, Deep and Shallow were looking out, and, you know... Scale was moving fast from bafflement to fury, his 2 favorite emotions, and never much of a gap between the 2, little eyes opening wider and wider until the white showed all the way around. I'll kill the rotten old bastard! He started to draw a sword, as if he was going to charge off through the woods to the ruin where Black Dow had their father's chair and slaughter Rod Penways on the spot. No, no, no! Calder grabbed his wrist with both hands, managed to stop him getting his sword from the sheath, and was nearly dragged off his feet doing it. Fuck him! Scale shrugged Calder off, punched the nearest tree trunk with one gauntleted fist, and tore a chunk of bark off it. Fuck the shit out of him! Let's kill him! Let's just kill him! He punched it again and brought a shower of seeds fluttering down. White-Eye Hansel looked on warily. Pale as Snow looked on wearily, both giving the strong impression this wasn't the first rage they'd had to deal with. You can't run around killing important people, coaxed Calder, palms up. He tried to kill you, didn't he? I'm a special case. Half the North wants me dead. That was a lie. It was closer to 3/4. And we've no proof. Calder put his hand on Scale's shoulder and spoke softly, the way their father used to. It's politics, brother. Remember? It's a delicate balance. Fuck politics and shit on the balance! But the rage had flickered down now, far enough that there was no danger of Scale's eyes popping out of his head. He rammed his sword back, hilt snapping against the scabbard. Can't we just fight? Calder took a long breath. How could this unreasoning thug be his father's son, and his father's heir besides? There'll be a time to fight, but for now we need to tread carefully. We're short on allies, Scale. I spoke to Ricci and he won't move against me, but he won't move for. Creeping bloody coward. Scale raised his fist to punch the tree again, and Calder pushed it gently down with one finger. Just worried for his daughter, and he wasn't the only one. Then there's Ironhead and Golden, neither too well disposed to us. If it weren't for their feud with each other, I dare say they'd have been begging Dow for the chance to kill me. Scale frowned. You think Dow was behind it? How could he not be? Calder had to squeeze down his frustration and his voice with it. He'd forgotten how much talking to his brother could be like talking to a tree stump. And anyway, Ricci had it from Dow's own mouth that he wants me dead. Scale shook his head, worried. I hadn't heard that. He's not likely to tell you, is he? But he had you hostage. Scale's brow was wrinkled with the effort of thinking it out. Why let you come back? Because he's hoping I'll start plotting, and then he'll be able to bring it all out and hang me nice and fair. Don't plot, then. You should be right enough with everyone. Don't be an idiot! A couple of Carls looked up from their water cups, and he pushed his voice back down. Scale could afford to lose his temper, Calder couldn't. We need to protect ourselves. We have enemies everywhere. True. And there's one you haven't talked about at all. Most dangerous of the lot, far as I can tell. Calder froze for a moment, wondering who he might have left out of his calculations. The fucking Union! Scale pointed through the trees towards the south with one thick finger. Croy and the Dogman and their 40,000 soldiers. The ones we've been fighting a war against. I've been, anyway. That's Black Dow's war, not mine. Scale slowly shook his head. Did you ever think it might be the easier, cheaper, safer path just to do what you're told? Thought about it, decided against. What we need... Listen to me. Scale came close, looking him right in the eye. There's a battle coming, and we have to fight. Do you understand? This is the North. We have to fight. Scale, you're the clever one. Far cleverer than me, everyone knows it.
The dead know I know it.
He leaned closer still.
But the men won't follow cleverness. Not without strength. You have to earn their respect.
Ha! Calder glanced around at the hard eyes in the trees.
Can't I just borrow it from you? One day I might not be here, and you'll need some respect of your own. You don't have to wade in blood. You just have to share the hardships and share the danger.
Calder gave a watery smile.
It's the danger that scares me.
He wasn't over keen on the hardships either, if the truth be known.
Fear is good.
Easy for him to say, whose skull was so thick fear couldn't get in.
Our father was scared every day of his life. Kept him sharp.
Scale took Calder's shoulder in a grip that wasn't to be resisted and turned him to face south. Between the trunks of the trees at the edge of the woods, he could see a long expanse of fields, gold and green and fallow brown. The western spur of the Heroes loomed up on the left, Scarling's finger sticking from the top, the grey streak of a road through the crops at its foot.
That track leads to the old bridge. Dow wants us to take it. Wants you to take it? Us. It's barely defended. Do you have a shield?
No, nor the slightest wish to go where he might need one.
Pale as snow. Lend me your shield there.
The waxy-faced old warrior handed it over to Calder. Painted white, appropriately enough. It had been a long time since he'd handled one, battered about a courtyard at sword practice, and he'd forgotten how much the damn things weighed. The feel of it on his arm brought back ugly memories of old humiliations, most of them at his brother's hands. But they'd probably be eclipsed by new ones before the day was out, if he lived through it. Scale patted Calder on his sore cheek again, unpleasantly firm again.
Stay close to me, and keep your shield up. You'll get through all right.
He jerked his head towards the men scattered in the trees.
And they'll think more of you just for seeing you up front.
Right. Calder hefted the shield with scant enthusiasm.
Who knows?
His brother slapped him on the back and nearly knocked him over.
Maybe you will too.
Ours not to reason why.
You just love that bloody horse, don't you, Tunny?
She makes better conversation than you, Forrest, that's for sure. And she's a damn sight better than walking. Aren't you, my darling? He nuzzled at her long face and fed her an extra handful of grain. My favourite animal in the whole bloody army. He felt a tap on his arm. Corporal? It was Yoke, looking off towards the hill. No, Yoke, I'm afraid to say you're nowhere near. In fact, you need to work hard at not being my least favourite animal. No, Corporal. Ain't that Gertz? Tunny frowned. Gorst. The necklace swordsman was riding across the river from the direction of the orchards on the far bank, horses' hooves dashing up spray, armour glinting dully in what had turned out to be bright sunlight. He spurred up the bank and into the midst of the regiment's officers, almost knocking one young lieutenant down. Tunny might have been amused, except there was something about Gorst that drained all the laughs from the world. He swung from the saddle, nimbly, for all his bulk, lumbered straight up to Colonel Valamir and gave a stiff salute. Tunny tossed his brush down and took a few steps towards them, watching closely. Long years in the military had given him a razor-keen sense of when he was about to get fucked, and he was having a painful premonition right now. Gorst spoke for a few moments, face a blank slab. Valamir shook an arm at the hill, then off to the west. Gorst spoke again. Tunny edged closer, trying to catch the details. Valamir flung up his hands in frustration, then stalked over, shouting.
First Sergeant Forrest! Sir, apparently there's a path through those bogs to our west. Sir, General Jallenhorn wants us to send the 1st Battalion through it. Make sure the Northmen can't use it against us. The bog beyond the old bridge. Yes. We won't be able to get horses through that. I know. We only just got them back, sir. I know. But what will we do with them in the meantime? You'll just have to bloody well leave them here, snapped Valamir. Do you think I like sending half my regiment across a bloody bog without their horses? Do you?
Forrest worked his jaw, scar down his cheek shifting.
No, sir.
Valamir strode away, beckoning over some of the officers. Forrest stood a moment, rubbing fiercely at the back of his head.
Corporal,
whispered Yoke in a small voice.
Yes. Is this another example of everyone shitting on the head of the man below?
Very good, Yoke. We may make a soldier of you yet. Forrest stopped in front of them, hands on hips, frowning off upriver.
Seems the 1st Battalion have a mission.
Marvellous, said Tunney.
We'll be leaving our horses here and heading west across that bog.
A chorus of groans greeted him.
You think I like it? Get packed and get moving.
And Forrest stomped off to break the happy news elsewhere.
How many men in the battalion?
Muttered Lederlingen. Tunney took a long breath.
About 500 when we left Adua.
Currently 400, give or take a recruit or two.
400 men?
Said Cligger.
Across a bog?
What sort of a bog is it?
Muttered Worth.
A bog!
Yoke squealed, like a tiny, angry dog yapping at a bigger one.
A bloody bog! A massive load of mud! What other sort of bog would it be?
But Lederlingen stared after Forrest and then at his horse, onto which he'd just loaded most of his gear and some of Tunney's.
This is stupid.
Tunney rubbed at his tired eyes with finger and thumb. How often had he had to explain this to a set of recruits?
Look, you think how stupid people are most of the time. Old men drunk, women at a village fair, boys throwing stones at birds. Life. The foolishness and the vanity, the selfishness and the waste. The pettiness, the silliness. You think in a war it must be different, must be better? With death around the corner, men united against hardship, the cunning of the enemy, people must think harder, faster, be better, be heroic.
He started to heave his packages down from his horse's saddle.
Only it's just the same. In fact, do you know, because of all that pressure and worry and fear, it's worse. There aren't many men who think clearest when the stakes are highest.
So people are even stupider in a war than the rest of the time, thinking about how they'll dodge the blame, or grab the glory, or save their skins, rather than about what will actually work. There's no job that forgives stupidity more than soldiering. No job that encourages it more. He looked at his recruits and found they were all staring back, horrified, except for an oblivious Yoke, straining on tiptoe to get his spear down from his horse, perhaps the largest in the regiment.
Never mind, he snapped. This bog won't cross itself.
He turned his back on them, patted his horse gently on the neck, and sighed.
Oh, well, old girl. Guess you'll have to manage a little longer without me.
Cry havoc and... Scorry was cutting hair when Craw got back to his dozen, or the 7 who were left, leastways. 8, including him. He wondered if there'd ever been a dozen that actually had the full 12. Sure as hell his never had. Agric sat on a fallen tree trunk all coated with ivy, frowning into nowhere as the shears snip-snipped around his face. Wirren was leaning against a tree. The father of swords stood up on its point, and the hilt cradled in his folded arms. He'd stripped his shirt off for some reason, and stood there in a leather vest, a big grey stain of old sweat down the front, and his long, sinewy arms sticking out. Seemed as if the more dangerous things got, the more clothes he liked to lose. Probably have his arse out by the time they were finished with this valley.
Craw!
He shouted, lifting his sword and shaking it around.
Hey, Chief!
Droft, sitting on a branch above with back against trunk, whittling a stick for an arrow shaft, shavings fluttering down.
Black Dow didn't kill you then?
Asked Wonderful.
Not right on the spot, anyway. Did he tell you what's to do?
Jon nodded towards the men crowding the woods all around. He had a lot less hair than when Craw left, and it made him look older somehow. Creases around his eyes and grey in his brows Craw never noticed before.
I get the feeling Dow's planning to go.
That he is. Craw winced as he squatted down in the brush, peering south. Seemed a different world out there beyond the tree line, all dark and comforting under the leaves. Quiet, like being sunk in cool water, all bathed in harsh sunlight outside. Yellow-brown barley under the blue sky, the heroes bulging up vivid green from the valley, the old stones on top still standing their pointless watch. Craw pointed over to their left towards Osram, the town no more than a hint of a high fence and a couple of grey towers over the crops.
Reeche's gonna move first, make a charge on Osram.
He found he was whispering, even though the Union were a good few hundred strides away on top of a hill and could hardly have heard him if he screamed.
He'll be carrying all the standards, make it look like that's the big push. Hope to draw some men down off the heroes. Reckon they'll fall for that?
Asked Jon.
Pretty thin, ain't it?
Craw shrugged.
Any trick looks thin to them who knows it's coming.
Don't make too much difference whether they go or not, though.
Wirren was stretching now, hanging from a tree branch, sword slung over his back.
We still got the same hill to climb.
Might help if there's half as many Union at the top when we get there.
Droft tossed down from his own perch. Let's hope they fall for it then, eh? Craw moved his hand to the right, towards the field and pasture between Osram and the heroes. If they do send men down from the hill, that's when Golden's going with his horse. Catch those boys' trousers down in the open and spill 'em all the way back to the river.
Drown those fuckers,
grunted Agric with rare bloodthirstiness. Meantime, Dow's going to make the main effort, straight at the heroes, Ironhead and Tenways alongside with all their lads. How's he going to work it? Asked Wonderful, rubbing at her new scar. Craw gave her a look.
Black Dow, innit? He's going to run up there head-on and make mud of everything ain't mud already.
And us? Craw swallowed.
Aye, we'll be along.
Front and centre, eh?
Up that bloody hill again,
growled Jon.
Almost makes you wish we'd fought the Union for it last time,
said Wirren, swinging from one branch to another. Craw pointed to their right.
Scales over there in the woods under Salt Fell. Once Dow's made his move, he's going to charge his horsemen down the Ustred Road and snatch the old bridge. Him and Calder.
Amazing how much Jon could disapprove with just a shake of his head.
Your old mate Calder, eh?
That's right. Craw looked straight at him. My old mate Calder.
Then this lovely valley and all its nothing much shall be ours,
sang Wirren.
Again.
Dow's, at any rate, said Wonderful. Droft was counting the names off on his fingers. Reechy, Golden, Ironhead, Tenways, Scale and Dow himself. That's a lot of men. Craw nodded.
Might be the most ever fought for the North in one spot. There's going to be quite a battle here,
said Jon.
Quite the hell of a battle.
One for the songs.
Wirren had hooked his legs over the branch and was hanging upside down now, for some reason best known to himself.
We're going to make a right mess of those Southerners.
Droft didn't sound entirely convinced, though.
By the dead, I hope so,
mouthed Craw. Jon edged forwards.
Did he get our guild, Chief?
Craw winced.
I weren't in the mood to bring it up.
There was a round of groans at that, just like he'd known there would be.
I'll get it later, don't worry. It's owed and you'll get it. I'll talk to Splitfoot.
Wonderful sucked her teeth.
You'd be better trying to get sense from Wirren than coin out a Splitfoot.
I heard that,
called Wirren.
Think on this,
said Craw, slapping Yon's chest with the back of his hand. You get up that hill, you'll be owed another guild. 2 at once. Ain't gonna be time to spend it now anyway, is there? We got a battle to fight. That much no one could argue with. Men were moving through the